My wife Beatrice had been in the ground for exactly 45 minutes when I realized my son was no longer my son. He was just a shark in a cheap suit waiting for the water to clear so he could feed. I stood there, a 73-year-old man in a black coat that suddenly felt too big for my shoulders, staring at the fresh mound of earth that covered the only woman I had ever loved. I wanted silence. I wanted a moment to tell Beatrice that I would be okay, even though I knew it was a lie. But silence is a luxury the greedy do not afford the grieving. While I held the first handful of dirt, feeling the cold, damp soil against my palm, I heard it. It wasn't a prayer. It wasn't a sob. It was a whisper, sharp and distinct, cutting through the gray Chicago wind. "It is a prime location, Dante. The market is peaking right now. If we list the house by next week, we could trigger a bidding war." It was Caroline, my daughter-in-law. She was standing 3 feet away from her mother-in-law's open grave discussing real estate values. She didn't even have the decency to lower her voice. She adjusted her sunglasses not to hide tears, but to check her reflection in the side of the hearse. I looked at my son Dante. I waited for him to hush her. I waited for him to tell her to show some respect for the woman who had scrimped and saved to put him through architecture school. But Dante just nodded. He looked at the grave, then he looked at his watch, and then he looked at the house keys dangling from my hand. That was the moment my heart didn't break. It hardened. It turned into something cold and heavy, like the iron engine blocks I used to lift back in the warehouse. Before I tell you what I found in that house that changed everything, I want to know something. Have you ever had family members who only showed up when they smelled money? Tell me your story in the comments below. And if you have ever had to stand your ground when everyone thought you were weak, hit that like button and subscribe. My name is Elijah Thorne, and this is how I taught my son the most expensive lesson of his life. The ride back to the house was silent. Not the comfortable silence Beatrice and I used to share while listening to jazz on the radio, but a suffocating silence. Dante drove my car because he said I was too emotional to drive. I wasn't emotional. I was calculating. I watched them in the rearview mirror. Caroline was texting furiously on her phone. Dante was sweating, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief, looking everywhere except at me. We arrived at the house. My house. The 2-story brick colonial in Bronzeville that Beatrice and I had bought 40 years ago when people said this neighborhood was dying. We had restored every inch of it ourselves. I sanded the floors. Beatrice hand-stitched the curtains. Every scratch on the banister had a story. Now, walking through the front door, it felt different. It felt like I was walking into a crime scene where the crime hadn't happened yet. The repast was a blur of potato salad and condolences from neighbors I hadn't seen in years. I sat in my armchair in the corner, the leather worn soft by decades of use. I just wanted them all to leave. I wanted to smell Beatrice's perfume, which still lingered in the hallways. Caroline approached me with a plate of food I didn't want. She was a tall woman with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She placed the plate on the small table beside me, and then, with a sleight of hand that would have impressed a magician, she slid a glossy brochure on top of my Bible. I picked it up. Sun Valley Senior Living, a luxury community for the golden years. I looked up at her. She didn't flinch. I just thought it might be good to start looking. "Dad," she said, her voice dripping with that fake sweetness that makes my teeth ache. "This house is so big. So much maintenance, and with your arthritis, stairs are a death trap. Sun Valley has a heated pool and 24-hour nursing staff. It is for your own safety." Safety. That is the word they always use when they want to take your freedom. They dress it up as concern. "I am not an invalid, Caroline," I said, my voice steady. "I mowed this lawn yesterday. I fixed the furnace last week. I think I can manage a flight of stairs." Dante walked over, holding a beer. He looked at the brochure, then at me. "She is just thinking ahead." "Pop," he said, "Mom is gone. You are here all alone in this mausoleum. It is depressing. Plus the property taxes are killing you, aren't they?" He knew nothing about my property taxes. He knew nothing about my finances because I was raised in a generation where a man's wallet is his private business. But I saw the desperation in his eyes. It wasn't about my safety. It was about urgency. They needed me out. Fast. I put the brochure down. "I am not going anywhere, Dante. This is my home. Beatrice is in every room of this house. I am not leaving her." Caroline sighed, a loud, theatrical exhale of frustration. She looked at Dante as if to say, I told you he would be difficult. She patted my shoulder, her nails digging in slightly. Let's not decide today, she said. You are grieving. You are not thinking clearly. We will discuss the logistics tomorrow. Logistics. She talked about my life like it was a shipping schedule. By 6 in the evening, the guests had left. The house was quiet, but the air was thick with tension. I walked down the hallway toward my study. I wanted to listen to one of Beatrice's favorite records, maybe pour a glass of bourbon, and finally let myself cry. The door to my study was ajar. I pushed it open. Dante and Caroline were standing in the center of the room. Caroline was holding one of my vintage vinyl records, flipping it over in her hands like it was a cheap frisbee. She was looking at the shelves, assessing, calculating. This room alone could be a third bedroom, she was saying to Dante. If we knock down that wall, open up the floor plan, we can list it as a modern open concept. The buyers in this area love open concept. Dante was looking at my desk. He was looking at the stack of unpaid bills I had intentionally left there, mostly junk mail and small utility costs. We need to move fast, Caroline, he whispered. The loan sharks gave me until the end of the month. If we don't liquidate this place, I am dead. Literally. I stood in the doorway, my shadow falling across the floorboards. Put that record down, I said. Caroline jumped. She nearly dropped the album, a first pressing of Miles Davis that was worth more than her car. She placed it back on the shelf, not with care, but with annoyance. We were just looking for some paperwork, Dad. Dante lied. His voice cracked. He was 40 years old, but in that moment he looked like a teenager caught stealing beer. We wanted to help you organize the insurance policies. I walked into the room and took the record from the shelf. I wiped the dust from the cover with my sleeve. You were measuring the walls, Dante. You were talking about knocking them down. Caroline stepped forward, dropping the act. Look, Elijah, let's be real here. We know you don't have savings. We know Beatrice's medical bills must have drained you. Dante and I are willing to help. We can sell this place, pay off your debts, and get you into a nice small studio at Sun Valley. The rest of the money can be invested. Dante has a great opportunity in crypto. He can triple the equity. I looked at my son, investing in crypto. The same son who had lost $20,000 on a pyramid scheme 3 years ago. The same son who borrowed $5,000 from his mother for a business idea that never materialized. And if I say no, I asked. Dante looked at his shoes. Caroline answered for him. Then you are being selfish. You are sitting on an asset you can't afford while your son is struggling. Is that what Beatrice would have wanted? To see her son suffer while you rattle around in a big empty house holding on to memories using her name? They were using a dead woman's name to manipulate me on the day of her funeral. I felt a fire in my chest, hot and consuming. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell them that the house was paid off 10 years ago. I wanted to tell them that I had a pension that covered everything I needed. I wanted to tell them that Dante's struggle was his own doing, born of laziness and a desire for shortcuts. But I looked at their faces. I saw the greed. I saw the lack of empathy. And I realized that arguing with them was useless. They didn't see a father. They saw an obstacle. I didn't yell. I didn't throw them out. I learned a long time ago working on the docks that you never show your enemy your full strength until you are ready to strike. I am tired, I said softly. My voice sounded old even to my own ears. I let my shoulders slump. I let the weariness wash over me. I need to sleep. Caroline smiled. It was a victory smile. She thought she had won. She thought the old man was folding. Get some rest, Dad, she said, her voice sickeningly sweet again. We will handle the paperwork. You just rest. We can start packing up the small things tomorrow. I walked out of the study. I climbed the stairs, holding the banister tightly, listening to them whisper excitedly below me. He is cracking, Caroline whispered. I will call the realtor in the morning. I reached the top of the stairs and walked down the hall to the master bedroom. I opened the door. The scent of lavender and old paper hit me. It was Beatrice's room. Our room. Her reading glasses were still on the nightstand. Her bookmark was still halfway through a history book on the civil rights movement. I walked inside and closed the door. I turned the lock. Click. I stood there in the darkness, leaning against the door. They thought I was weak. They thought I was senile. They thought they could strip mine my life and toss me into a facility to rot. I looked at Beatrice's vanity table. I walked over and sat down on the small velvet stool. I looked at myself in the mirror. Gray hair lined face-tired eyes. But behind those eyes, the fire was still burning. I am not done, Beatrice, I whispered to the empty room. I am not done. My hand brushed against the velvet lining of her jewelry drawer. I felt something loose. A piece of the lining was unglued. I frowned. Beatrice was a perfectionist. She never left things broken. I pulled at the loose fabric. It lifted away, revealing a false bottom. My heart started to pound. There, nestled in the secret compartment, was a red velvet box, and on top of it, a letter with my name on it written in Beatrice's elegant looping handwriting. I picked up the envelope. My hands were trembling. "Elijah," it read. "Please forgive me." I opened the letter. A small brass key slid out and hit the glass top of the vanity with a heavy clink. It looked old, rusted. The tag on it had a faded number 404. I unfolded the letter and began to read. And as I read, the grief in my chest began to make room for something else. Shock. And then a slow, cold realization of power. My son thought I was a pauper. My daughter-in-law thought I was a burden. They were about to find out that Elijah Thorne was neither. They wanted a war. They just handed me the ammunition. I looked at the key again. Tomorrow I wouldn't be going to a nursing home. Tomorrow I was going to Unit 404. The rain hammered against the window pane like handfuls of gravel thrown by an angry ghost. It was a fitting soundtrack for the evening. Downstairs, the house was finally quiet. The guests had left, taking their sympathies and their potato salad with them, leaving me alone with the two people who ostensibly loved me, but looked at me like an expired coupon. I had locked the door to the master bedroom. This was Beatrice's sanctuary, a space that smelled of lavender and old paper, a scent that used to mean safety but now just meant absence. I sat at her vanity table. It was a delicate piece of furniture, mahogany with curved legs, something we had found at an estate sale 30 years ago. Beatrice loved it. She said it made her feel like a movie star from the 40s. I picked up her silver hairbrush. A few strands of her gray hair were still caught in the bristles. I brought it to my nose and inhaled deeply, closing my eyes, trying to conjure her presence one last time. But the grief was heavy, a physical weight on my chest that made it hard to breathe. I needed to clean. That was how I dealt with pain. I worked. I fixed. I organized. I began to clear the surface of the vanity, placing her lipsticks and perfume bottles into a small box I would keep in my closet. I picked up the velvet lining at the bottom of the center drawer to dust underneath it. It was supposed to be glued down, but the corner lifted easily. Too easily. I frowned. Beatrice was a perfectionist. She never left things in disrepair. If a hem was loose, she stitched it. If a hinge squeaked, she oiled it. A loose drawer liner was out of character. I pulled the fabric back further. There, nestled in a hollowed-out space in the wood, sat a small box covered in red velvet. It looked old, the fabric worn bald at the corners. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a slow, heavy rhythm of anticipation. I had been married to this woman for 4 decades. I thought I knew every secret she had. I thought I knew every hiding place in this house. I lifted the box. It was heavy for its size. Tucked under it was an envelope, the paper yellowed with age. On the front, in Beatrice's unmistakable looping cursive, was a single word: Elijah. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. I pulled out the letter. The date at the top was from 5 years ago. Elijah, my love, it began. If you are reading this, I am gone. And if I am gone, I can no longer protect you from the truth I have been hiding. Please forgive me. I have kept a storage unit for 40 years. I never told you because I knew you. You are a good man, a provider. If you knew what was in there, you would have sold it all years ago to pay for Dante's college or his first car, or to bail him out of that business mess in 2010. But he does not deserve it, Elijah. He never did. I stopped reading. The air in the room felt suddenly thin. Beatrice knew. She had seen the greed in our son long before I allowed myself to admit it. I had spent years making excuses for Dante, calling him ambitious when he was reckless, calling him misunderstood when he was manipulative. Beatrice had seen him clearly. I continued reading. He sees us as resources, not parents. I have saved this for you. It is your retirement, your freedom, your safety net. Do not let him take it. Do not tell him about Unit 404 in the old container district. The key is in the box. I love you, Elijah. Be strong for yourself now. I opened the red velvet box. Inside lay a single brass key. It was tarnished, heavy and cold. The number 404 was stamped into the metal. I gripped it tight, the edges digging into my palm. A mixture of rage and sorrow washed over me. She had carried this burden alone to protect me. She had been the gatekeeper of a fortune I didn't know existed, guarding it from the wolf we had raised in our own home. Suddenly, a sharp knock on the bedroom door shattered the silence. "Dad, are you in there?" It was Dante. His voice was muffled through the wood, pitched in that performative tone of concern he had been using all day. I quickly shoved the letter and the box into the deep pocket of my cardigan. I composed my face, wiping the moisture from my eyes. I didn't want him to see me cry. Not anymore. I unlocked the door and opened it. Dante stood there, holding a manila folder. He had loosened his tie and his eyes were red-rimmed. If I didn't know better, I would have thought he had been weeping. But after reading Beatrice's letter, I saw the redness for what it was. Strain. The strain of acting. "Hey, Pop," he said softly, stepping into the room without asking. "I just wanted to check on you. This room, it still smells like Mom, doesn't it?" He walked over to the bed and ran his hand over the quilt. It was a nice touch, a sentimental gesture designed to disarm me. I stayed by the door, my hand still clutching the key in my pocket. "What do you want, Dante?" He turned, looking hurt. "I don't want anything, Dad. Caroline and I are worried. We were looking over the estate paperwork and we realized that if something happens to you, God forbid, the state could freeze everything. Probate court is a nightmare, Pop. It could take years to sort out. Mom wouldn't want you stressing about legal fees." He held out the folder. I had the lawyer draw up a standard management agreement. It just allows me to handle the bills, talk to the insurance company, that sort of thing. Just until you are back on your feet. I looked at the document. It wasn't a management agreement. It was a durable power of attorney. It would give him full control over my finances, my property, and my medical decisions. If I signed this, he could sell the house tomorrow and put me in a home the day after. He held out a pen. A fancy gold fountain pen I had bought him for his graduation. "Just sign right here at the bottom," he said, tapping the paper. "Let me carry the burden for a while, Dad. You have done enough." I looked at his face. He was sweating slightly on his upper lip. He was terrified I would say no, but he was banking on my grief making me pliable. He thought I was a broken old man who just wanted to sleep. Slowly, I walked over to the nightstand where a stack of my own papers sat. I picked up my reading glasses and put them on. "You are right, Dante," I said. My voice was raspy. Mom wouldn't want me to worry about the house. I saw his shoulders relax. He exhaled. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Exactly, Pop. Exactly." I reached into the stack of papers on the nightstand. Earlier that week, I had received a homestead exemption renewal form from the county. It looked remarkably similar to the legal document Dante was holding, dense text, official seal line for a signature at the bottom. But this document didn't give power away. It cemented my residency and ownership for another year. I pretended to stumble slightly, dropping Dante's folder on the bed mixed with my papers. "I am so tired, Dante," I muttered, shuffling the papers with shaking hands. "I just want this done." "Here, let me help," he said, reaching out. "No," I snapped, pulling back. Then I softened my tone. "No, I need to do this myself. A man signs his own name." I deftly slid his power of attorney document under the bedspread and pulled the homestead renewal to the top. I shielded the header with my arm, leaning over the nightstand as if supporting my weight. "Where do I sign?" I asked. Dante didn't check the paper. He was too eager. He pointed to the line at the bottom. "Right there." I signed my name. Elijah Thorne. The letters were bold and dark. I handed him the paper face down. He snatched it up, folding it quickly before looking at it, terrified I might change my mind. "Thank you, Dad," he said, his voice thick with relief. "You did the right thing. I will take care of everything. You won't have to lift a finger." He practically ran out of the room, clutching the useless tax form like it was a winning lottery ticket. I stood there for a moment, listening to his heavy footsteps retreating down the stairs. Then I heard him whisper loudly to Caroline in the hallway below. "Got it. We are in business." I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. I walked to the closet and grabbed my heavy raincoat and my flat cap. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't need clothes. I needed answers. I walked down the back stairs, bypassing the living room where Dante and Caroline were likely already popping a bottle of wine to celebrate their victory. I slipped out the kitchen door into the storm. The rain was coming down in sheets now, cold and unrelenting. My old Ford F-150 was parked in the driveway, its black paint dull under the streetlights. I climbed in the cabin, smelling of old leather and gasoline, the smell of work, the smell of truth. I put the key into the ignition, but before I turned it, I pulled the brass key labeled 404 out of my pocket. I held it up to the dashboard light. 40 years, Beatrice, I whispered. 40 years you protected me. Now let's see what you were protecting. I fired up the engine. It roared to life, a deep guttural growl that sounded like a beast waking up. I backed out of the driveway, casting one last look at the house. The lights were on in the living room. I could see the silhouettes of my son and his wife moving around, confident, arrogant, and completely unaware that the man they thought they had buried was coming for them. I shifted into gear and drove into the darkness, headed for the old container district. The night was young, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt alive. The drive to the old container district took 40 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. The rain hadn't let up. It battered the windshield of my old Ford truck, blurring the neon lights of the city into streaks of red and blue. This part of town was the ghost of Chicago's industrial past. Rusted fences, abandoned warehouses with broken windows that looked like missing teeth, and streetlights that flickered with a dying buzz. I pulled up to the gate of the storage facility. It wasn't one of those climate-controlled, high-security places with bright hallways and keypad entry. This was a graveyard for forgotten things. The sign above the gate was peeling half the letters missing, simply reading storage. I rolled down my window and punched in the code Beatrice had written on the back of the envelope. The keypad was sticky and the buttons were worn down, but after a moment of hesitation, the gate groaned open, the metal screeching against the wet pavement like a banshee. I drove through the rows of corrugated metal units. They looked like coffins lined up in the dark. My headlights cut through the rain, illuminating the numbers painted on the doors. 400, 402. And there it was, Unit 404. I killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the drumming of rain on the roof of the truck. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. My heart was pounding against my ribs. Part of me was terrified. What if Beatrice had hidden something terrible? What if this was a secret life I didn't want to know about? Debts, gambling. Another family. No, not Beatrice. Beatrice was truth. Beatrice was dignity. I took a deep breath, grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment, and stepped out into the storm. The cold rain soaked through my coat instantly, but I didn't feel it. I walked to the roll-up door. The padlock was old, covered in a layer of rust that flaked off on my fingers. I inserted the brass key. It resisted at first, gritty and stiff, but I wiggled it, coaxing it just like I used to coax the old machines at the plant. With a sharp click, the shackle popped open. I hooked my fingers under the bottom of the door and heaved. It was heavy, the springs protesting loudly as I shoved it upward. The door rattled into its housing, revealing a cavern of darkness. The smell hit me first. It wasn't the smell of money. It wasn't the smell of gold or perfume. It was the smell of stagnation, mildew, dust, old paper decomposing in the damp air. It was the smell of a basement that hadn't been opened in decades. I clicked on my flashlight and swept the beam across the space. My heart sank. It dropped right into my stomach and turned into a cold stone. It was junk. Wall to wall, floor to ceiling, it was filled with junk. I stood there, the rain dripping from the brim of my cap, staring in absolute disbelief. There were stacks of yellowing newspapers tied with twine that looked ready to disintegrate. There were cardboard boxes sagging from moisture. There were pieces of furniture with missing legs piled haphazardly on top of each other. Old rags were draped over mounds of shapeless debris. I felt a laugh bubbling up in my throat, a bitter, hysterical laugh. Beatrice. My organized, meticulous, brilliant Beatrice. Was she a hoarder? Was this the secret she had kept from me for 40 years? That she couldn't throw anything away. I stepped inside my boots, crunching on broken glass or maybe dried leaves. I walked deeper into the unit, shining the light on the chaos. A broken chair with the upholstery torn out. A crate filled with what looked like empty glass bottles. A stack of magazines that had fused together into a solid brick of pulp. Disappointment washed over me, hot and stinging. I don't know what I had thought. I had hoped for salvation. I had hoped for something that would give me leverage against Dante and Caroline. But this was just a mess. This was a burden. Caroline was right. This was just a pile of trash that I would have to pay to haul away. My wife wasn't a secret millionaire. She was a woman who couldn't let go of the past, literally. I felt a sudden surge of anger, not at her, but at the situation, at the universe. I kicked a rotting cardboard box at my feet. "Damn it, Beatrice!" I shouted, my voice echoing in the metallic space. "Why did you leave me this?" The box I kicked tore open. It was wet and weak. Something rolled out of it, clattering across the concrete floor before coming to a stop against the toe of my boot. I looked down. It was a small round tin. It didn't look like trash. It caught the light of my flashlight. I bent down and picked it up. It was cold metal. I wiped the layer of gray dust off the lid with my thumb. The colors underneath were faded but still visible, green and gold. And a face. A face of a black woman, elegant and stern. I squinted to read the text. Madam C.J. Walker's Wonderful Hair Grower. I froze. I knew this brand. Every black person of my generation knew this brand. But this tin, it looked different. It looked ancient. I turned it over. Stamped into the metal was a date. 1910. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck. This wasn't a reproduction. This was an original. I remembered Beatrice telling me stories about Madam C.J. Walker, the first female self-made millionaire in America. Beatrice loved history. She taught history. I looked back at the box I had kicked. I shone the light inside. It wasn't full of trash. It was full of more tins. Combs. Straightening combs made of heavy iron. Packaging that I had only seen in museums. I carefully set the tin down on a dry shelf and turned my attention to the stack of newspapers I had dismissed as garbage. I walked over to them. They were bound with twine, but not carelessly. They were bundled by date. I pulled the top paper loose. The paper was brittle, flaking at the edges. I was terrified to tear it. I shone the light on the masthead. It didn't say the Chicago Tribune. It didn't say the Daily News. It read the North Star. My breath caught in my throat. I looked at the date, December 3rd, 1847. I staggered back, needing to lean against the wall to keep from falling. The North Star. Frederick Douglass's abolitionist newspaper. These weren't old papers for recycling. These were original prints, first editions. My hands were shaking so hard the flashlight beam was dancing on the walls. I looked around the room again. The broken furniture, the rags, the crates. I moved to the chair with the torn upholstery. I knelt down and looked closely at the wood. It was mahogany, hand-carved. The lines were geometric, bold. Art Deco. I looked underneath the seat. There was a maker's mark branded into the wood. I didn't recognize it, but the craftsmanship was undeniable. It wasn't broken. It was disassembled. The legs were tied together and wrapped in burlap to protect them. I pulled the rag off the mound next to it. It wasn't a rag, it was a quilt. But not just a quilt, it was a story quilt. The stitching was intricate, depicting scenes of migration of families walking with suitcases of trains heading north. The colors were faded, but the fabric was heavy, durable cotton. This was folk art. This was early 20th century African-American textile art. I sat down on a dusty crate, overwhelmed. It wasn't a hoard. It was an archive. Beatrice hadn't been collecting trash. She had been rescuing history. For 40 years, she must have been going to estate sales, flea markets, and alleys, picking up the things that white society had deemed worthless, the things that black families had been forced to leave behind or sell for pennies. She saw the value in our history when no one else did. I looked at the crate of empty bottles. They were medicine bottles from the Freedmen's Bureau era. I looked at the magazines. They were early editions of Ebony and Jet in mint condition beneath the dust jacket. Tears finally spilled over my cheeks, hot and fast. I wasn't crying from grief anymore. I was crying from awe. She knew that if she brought this home, if she displayed it, people would ask questions. And if Dante knew, he wouldn't see the history. He wouldn't see Frederick Douglass's words or Madam C.J. Walker's triumph. He would see dollar signs. He would see eBay listings. He would have sold the North Star to buy a new car. He would have sold the quilt to pay a gambling debt. She kept it here in this damp, dark hole to keep it safe. To keep it safe for me. I stood up and shone the light around the room one more time. To the untrained eye, to a person like Caroline who only saw value in things that glittered and were brand new, this room was a nightmare. It was a dump. It was a hassle. But to a collector, to a museum, I was standing in the middle of a fortune. There were millions of dollars in this room. But more than that, there was a soul in this room. A plan began to form in my mind. A plan as sharp and cold as the winter wind outside. Dante and Caroline wanted to sell the junk in the storage unit. They wanted to get rid of the hoarder's mess, so they didn't have to pay the $50 monthly rental fee. They thought they were burdened with trash. I wiped the tears from my face. I picked up the Madam C.J. Walker tin and slipped it into my pocket right next to the key. I would let them. I would let them think this was garbage. I would let them be so blinded by their own arrogance and their dismissal of anything that looked old or ghetto that they would practically pay someone to take it off their hands. I walked out of the unit and pulled the heavy door down. The slam echoed like a gunshot. I locked the padlock. I walked back to my truck, the rain soaking me again, but this time I didn't mind. I felt lighter. I felt stronger. I wasn't just a grieving widower anymore. I was the guardian of the treasure. I sat in the truck and looked at the phone. I had one call to make. Not to Dante, not to Caroline. I dialed a number I hadn't called in years. "Marcus," I said, when the voice answered on the third ring. "It is Elijah Thorne. Listen, old friend, I need you to meet me, and bring your magnifying glass. You are not going to believe what Beatrice left us." I started the engine and drove away from Unit 404. The treasure was safe. Now it was time to set the trap. Here is the detailed script for Part 4, written in English, designed for an emotional and engaging AI voiceover. The drive back from the old container district felt different. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets of Chicago slick and black, reflecting the streetlights like spilled oil. Inside the cab of my truck, I felt a strange sense of calm. It was the calm of a soldier who has just inspected his armory and knows he has the winning weapon. But as I pulled into my driveway, that calm shattered. My house was lit up like a Christmas tree. Every light in every room was blazing. Through the front bay window, I could see silhouettes moving. Not just Dante and Caroline. There were others, strangers. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My wife had been in the ground for less than 12 hours and already the vultures were circling. I turned off the ignition, took a deep breath, and prepared myself. I had to remember my role. I wasn't Elijah Thorne, the man who had just discovered a $1 million collection of black history. I was Elijah, the tired, confused, grieving widower. I slumped my shoulders. I put a tremor in my hand. I opened the door and stepped out. Walking into my own home felt like walking into a violation. The air didn't smell like home anymore. It smelled of aggressive cologne and cleaning chemicals. In the living room, a man in a cheap suit was running a laser tape measure along the ceiling. Another woman was tapping on the walls with a clipboard in hand. They were talking about my home as if it were a carcass to be butchered. "Great bones," the man said, "but the crown molding is dated. We would need to strip that out." I stood in the entryway, water dripping from my coat onto the hardwood floor. "Who are these people?" I asked. My voice came out raspy, perfect for the part I was playing. Caroline stepped out of the kitchen. She was holding a glass of my best wine, the one I was saving for my 50th anniversary. She didn't look guilty. She looked annoyed that I was interrupting. "Oh, good you are back," she said, taking a sip. "Dad, this is Mr. Henderson and his associate. They are doing a preliminary appraisal. We need to know what we are working with if we are going to list next month." I looked at Mr. Henderson. He gave me a tight, pitying smile, the kind you give to a child or a dog that is in the way. "I didn't agree to this, Caroline," I said, leaning against the door frame as if I needed the support. "Beatrice isn't even cold yet." Caroline rolled her eyes. She set the wine glass down on a coaster, but she missed, and the red liquid splashed onto the lace doily Beatrice had crocheted. Caroline didn't even notice. She walked over to me, her heels clicking sharply on the wood. "Stop being so dramatic, Elijah," she said. "We are being practical, but we need to talk about where you went tonight." She crossed her arms. Her eyes narrowed. "Dante told me you went for a drive to clear your head, but I checked the family locator on your phone plan. You didn't go for a drive. You went to the industrial park, specifically to that run-down storage facility on 4th Street. My blood ran cold. I had forgotten about the family plan. Dante had added me to it 2 years ago, claiming it was cheaper. I didn't realize it was a digital leash. I just needed to check on some things," I stammered, looking down at my muddy boots. Caroline laughed. It was a harsh, barking sound. "Check on things," she mocked. "Dad, I know what is in those units. It is junk. I saw you pull out of there. I know Beatrice had a problem. We found the bank statements showing the monthly payments. $50 a month for 40 years. Do you know how much money that is? $24,000. Wasted. On storing garbage." She stepped closer, invading my personal space. She smelled of expensive perfume and ruthlessness. I saw the way you looked when you came in, she continued. You looked guilty. You know it is trash. Old newspapers, broken furniture. I bet it is full of mold. I looked up at her, letting my eyes widen with feigned fear. It is not trash, Caroline. It is memories. Beatrice kept things that mattered to us. Please, you can't touch it. This was the test. If I defended the value of the items, she would get curious. She would look. She would see the dates on the newspapers or the brand on the furniture. But if I defended the sentiment, if I acted like a pathetic old hoarder clinging to worthless trinkets, her arrogance would blind her. Caroline scoffed. Memories don't pay the bills, Elijah. We are trying to save you from financial ruin, and you are hoarding trash in a rat-infested locker. She turned to Dante, who had just walked in from the kitchen eating a sandwich, my sandwich. Dante, your father has been paying to store a room full of garbage for decades, she announced. Dante chewed slowly, looking at me with disappointment. Really? Pop. Is that where the money went? I moved toward them, clasping my hands together in a pleading gesture. Dante, please, I begged. My voice cracked. There are old papers in there. Beatrice's books, some old hair products she liked. It is all I have left of her hobbies. Just let me keep the unit. I will pay for it. I will find the money. Caroline held up a hand to stop me. Absolutely not, she said firmly. We are cutting costs. We are trimming the fat. That unit is a liability. What if there are rats? What if there is a fire hazard? The estate is liable. She pulled her phone out of her pocket. I am calling a junk removal service on Monday, she declared. 1-800-GOT-JUNK. They will clear the whole thing out. Sweep it clean. We might even get $50 back for the scrap metal if we are lucky. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. The trap was set. But I had to sell it. I had to make them believe that losing that junk was devastating to me emotionally so they wouldn't look for financial value. No, I shouted, grabbing Caroline's arm. She recoiled as if I had burned her. Don't touch me, she hissed. I pulled back, making myself look small. Please, Caroline, please don't throw it away. I will go through it. I will sort it. Just give me a month. Her eyes glinted. She saw my desperation and she loved it. To her, my begging was proof of her power. It was proof that she was the rational adult and I was the senile child. No, she said, smoothing her blouse where I had touched it. Monday, Elijah. It is done. I don't want you going back there and bringing that filth into this house to clutter it up before the open house. She turned back to the appraiser. Mr. Henderson, ignore the clutter in the study. We are having a professional crew come in to liquidate all the non-essential items next week. Liquidation. That was their word for erasing my life. I stood there for a moment, letting my chin drop to my chest. I let out a long, shuddering sigh of defeat. Okay, I whispered. Okay, you win. Just let me go to bed. Caroline smiled. It was the smile of a predator that has just killed its prey and is ready to eat. Good choice, Dad, she said dismissively. Sleep tight. We have a big day of packing tomorrow. I shuffled toward the stairs, dragging my feet. I looked like a beaten man. I felt Dante's eyes on my back, but he didn't say a word. He didn't offer to save his mother's things. He just took another bite of his sandwich. I climbed the stairs, the heavy tread of my boots masking the lightness in my heart. They took the bait. They swallowed it whole. Caroline thought she was punishing me by ordering the unit to be cleared. She thought she was hurting me by treating Beatrice's legacy like trash. She didn't realize she was handing me the keys to the kingdom. I reached the top of the landing and walked into my bedroom. I closed the door and locked it. I moved to the window and looked down at the driveway. Mr. Henderson was leaving. I saw Caroline and Dante in the window below toasting with wine glasses. They were celebrating their victory. I pulled the phone from my pocket. I had a text message from Marcus. I have the truck ready, the text read. And I have the cash. I typed a reply, my fingers flying across the screen. Monday morning. Be there at 8 a.m. They are hiring a junk crew. You need to intercept them. You are the buyer. I sent the message and deleted the thread. Caroline wanted to sell the unit for scrap fine. I would make sure the scrap dealer was the only man in Chicago who knew what gold looked like when it was covered in dust. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the empty spot where Beatrice used to sleep. You were right, my love, I whispered into the darkness. They don't deserve a dime. And after Monday, they won't get one. I lay back on the pillows listening to the murmurs of greed drifting up from the floorboards below. For the first time in a long time, I slept soundly, because I knew that when Monday came, the war would truly begin, and they had no idea they were already losing. Sunday morning in Chicago has a rhythm all its own. Usually it is the sound of church bells ringing across the city and the smell of bacon frying in kitchens. But this Sunday, the only rhythm I felt was the nervous thumping of my own heart against my ribs. I had parked my truck around the corner from the storage facility waiting. The rain from the previous night had washed the city clean, leaving the pavement dark and slick. I checked my watch, 7:55. Marcus was never late. We had served in Vietnam together. We had worked the assembly line together before he found his calling in history and antiques. I looked in the rearview mirror. A black sedan, unassuming but well-maintained, turned the corner and slowed to a stop behind me. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. I stepped out of the truck. Marcus stepped out of his car. He was 70 years old, but he stood as straight as a rod. He was wearing a trench coat and a fedora, looking like he had just stepped out of a black and white movie. He didn't smile. He just nodded. It was the nod of a man who knew that if I was calling him at this hour on this weekend, something was serious. We walked to the gate. I punched in the code. The metal gate groaned open, a harsh sound in the quiet morning. I didn't say much as we walked to Unit 404. I just unlocked the padlock and heaved the door up. The smell of mildew and old paper wafted out again. In the daylight, it looked even worse than it had the night before. The piles of newspapers, the broken furniture, the stacked boxes. It looked like a disaster. Marcus stood at the threshold. He didn't wrinkle his nose. He adjusted his glasses and pulled a pair of white cotton gloves from his pocket. "You said Beatrice kept this secret for 40 years, he said softly. "Yes," I replied. "My son thinks it is garbage. He wants to hire a junk crew to clear it out tomorrow." Marcus stepped inside. He moved differently than I did. I moved with caution. He moved with reverence. He walked past the stack of newspapers that I now knew were abolitionist originals. He went straight to a stack of cardboard boxes in the back that I hadn't even opened yet. They were marked simply kitchen. He opened the top flap. He reached in and pulled out a ceramic bowl. To me, it looked like something you would put fruit in. Marcus turned it over, examining the base with a small magnifying loupe he pulled from his pocket. He went still. "Elijah," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "do you know what this is?" "It is a bowl, Marcus," I said. "It is a Dave Drake," he corrected me. "Dave the Potter, an enslaved artist from South Carolina in the 1850s. He signed his work, which was illegal for slaves at the time. This isn't a bowl. This is an act of rebellion. There are museums that would kill for this piece." I felt a chill run down my spine. Beatrice, my quiet schoolteacher wife. She hadn't just been collecting things, she had been rescuing voices. Marcus moved on. He pointed to the crate of old magazines I had seen. He carefully lifted the top one. It was a comic book. The cover was bright despite the dust. A man in a blue suit holding a car over his head. "Action Comics #1, Marcus said. He didn't even pick it up. He just stared at it. He looked at me, his eyes wide behind his glasses. "Elijah, please tell me you haven't touched this with your bare hands." I shook my head. "This is the first appearance of Superman," he said. 1938. Depending on the condition inside and from the look of the spine, it is immaculate. This single book is worth more than this entire building. He turned to look at the rest of the unit. He looked at the furniture, the quilts, the stacks of records. He wasn't looking at junk anymore. He was looking at a vault. He took a deep breath and took off his glasses, wiping them with a handkerchief. He looked shaken. "Elijah," he said, looking me dead in the eye. "I have been in this business for 30 years. I have seen estates in Gold Coast and mansions in Lake Forest, but I have never seen anything like this. Beatrice didn't just hoard, she curated. This is a time capsule of African-American resilience and pop culture history." He gestured to the room. "You asked me to appraise it. I can't, not right here. It would take me months to catalog this. But if I had to give you a conservative estimate, just a ballpark number," I swallowed hard. "Give it to me." $4 million, he said, "maybe 5. And that is just what I can see from the doorway." My knees felt weak. I had to sit down on one of the crates. $5 million. And Dante was worried about a $200,000 debt. Caroline was worried about the cost of a rental unit. Marcus walked over and put a hand on my shoulder. Your daughter-in-law, Caroline, she runs that boutique real estate firm, right? The one that is always in the local paper. I nodded. Elijah, the comic book collection in that corner alone, could buy her company twice over. She is sitting on a lottery ticket and she is treating it like a tissue. A silence fell between us. The gravity of the situation settled in. My wife had left me a fortune, but she had also left me a test of character. If I told Dante and Caroline the truth right now, they would change their tune instantly. They would love me. They would cherish me. They would wrap me in cotton and serve me breakfast in bed. But it wouldn't be real. It would be for the money. And the moment the money was transferred to their accounts, I would be discarded again. I looked up at Marcus. They want to throw it away, Marcus. They told me they are hiring a junk removal service for Monday morning. They said they might get $50 for the scrap metal. Marcus's face hardened. He put his glasses back on. So what do you want to do, Elijah? We can call an auction house right now. We can get security here. We can expose them. No, I said. The word came out sharp. No, I don't want to expose them. Not yet. I want to buy it. Marcus looked confused. Buy it? It is already yours. Legally, yes. But Dante has me convinced that I need to liquidate. If I claim it is valuable, they will fight me for it. They will say I am incompetent. They will drag this into court and the lawyers will eat up half the value. I need to sever their claim to it. I need them to willingly, legally sell it to me for nothing. I stood up. I felt the strength returning to my legs. I need you to do me a favor, Marcus. Name it. I need you to come back here tomorrow morning, but not as Marcus the historian, not as Marcus the antique expert in the three-piece suit. I pointed to his elegant clothes. I need you to come as Marcus the junk man. I need you to find the dirtiest, most beat-up truck you can find. I need you to wear overalls. I need you to look like you smell like old grease. Marcus started to smile. A slow, mischievous smile that reminded me of the time we smuggled a turkey into the barracks in '68. You want me to lowball them, he said. I want you to insult them with your offer, I replied. I want you to act like you are doing them a favor by taking this trash off their hands. They are arrogant, Marcus. They see what they want to see. They will see a dirty old man wanting to buy dirty old junk, and they will sign whatever paper you put in front of them just to get you away from their expensive shoes. Marcus laughed, a deep, rich sound. I still have my old work van, he said. The suspension is shot and the muffler is loud as hell. It is perfect. Bring cash, I said. Small bills. Make it look like you scraped it together. How much should I offer? I looked at the Dave Drake bowl. I looked at the Superman comic. I looked at the legacy of my wife. Offer them $500, I said, and make them haggle for it. Marcus extended his hand. I took it. His grip was firm, warm, and reassuring. I will be here at 8 o'clock, a.m. sharp, he said. You just make sure they are here to sign the release. I will, I said. Marcus turned to leave, but then he stopped and looked back at the unit. Beatrice was a queen, Elijah, he said softly. She built you a kingdom in the shadows. She sure did, I whispered. I watched him drive away. I stood there for a moment longer looking at the dusty boxes. I wasn't just looking at objects, I was looking at freedom. I pulled the door down and locked it. The click of the padlock sounded like the cocking of a gun. I walked back to my truck. I had a role to play. I had to go home and be the sad, defeated old man for one more day. I had to let Caroline smirk at me. I had to let Dante pity me. I started the engine, let them enjoy their Sunday, let them drink their mimosas and plan their renovations, because Monday morning was coming, and Monday morning was going to be Judgment Day. I drove home with a slight smile on my face, the kind of smile that nobody would notice, but that changed the temperature of the entire room. I was ready. The trap was set, the bait was laid, and the rats were hungry. Monday morning arrived with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. The storm had passed, leaving behind a gray, washed-out sky that matched the complexion of my son. I sat at the kitchen table nursing a cup of black coffee, watching Dante pace the floor. He looked terrible. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin pale and clammy, and he kept checking his phone every 30 seconds as if he expected it to explode. Caroline was at the counter, furiously typing on her laptop. She was already in her war paint, a sharp blazer, perfect makeup, and an attitude that could cut glass. The air in the kitchen was so thick with tension you could choke on it. I decided to start the performance. I put my coffee cup down with a clatter, making Dante jump. "You look sick, son," I said, keeping my voice shaky and concerned. "Is it the grief? Missing your mother?" Dante stopped pacing. He looked at me, and for a second I saw the terrified little boy he used to be when he broke a window. But that boy was gone. Replacing him was a man drowning in his own mistakes. "It is not grief, Dad," he snapped, then lowered his voice. "It is complications." Caroline stopped typing. She slammed her laptop shut. "Tell him, Dante," she ordered. "We don't have time for secrets if we are going to liquidate the assets he needs to know why we are in a rush." Dante slumped into the chair opposite me. He put his head in his hands. "I made some bad calls, Pop," he mumbled into his palms. "What kind of calls?" I asked. "Investments," he said, looking up. "Crypto. It was a sure thing. Everyone said it was going to the moon. I leveraged some accounts. I borrowed against the firm." He paused, swallowing hard. "And I might have borrowed from some private lenders." Private lenders. That was the polite word for loan sharks. I looked at his hands. They were trembling. "How much, Dante?" I asked. He didn't answer. He just looked at Caroline. 200,000, Caroline said coldly. "And they want it by Friday. Or they start breaking things. And they are not talking about furniture." I let out a low whistle. $200,000. He had gambled away a fortune on invisible money while his mother was dying in a hospital bed. The anger flared in my chest, hot and sharp, but I pushed it down. I had to stay in character. I had to be the bewildered, helpless old man. 200,000, I whispered, clutching my chest. "Oh, Lord." "Dante." "How could you stop the theatrics?" Elijah Caroline cut in. "We don't need a sermon. We need cash. That is why the house has to go. That is why we are stripping everything." She walked over to the window and looked out at the driveway. "And speaking of stripping everything," she said, a cruel smile touching her lips, "your junk man is here." My heart did a little flip. "Marcus." I stood up slowly, leaning heavily on the table. "Who?" I asked. "The scrap guy," Caroline said. "I called around last night. Most places wanted to charge me to haul that trash away. But I found one guy. Said he buys old paper for recycling and scrapes metal. He offered a flat fee for the contents of the unit." She turned to me, her eyes hard. "He is paying $500, Elijah." I let my jaw drop. $500, I stammered. But Beatrice collected things for 40 years. There is furniture. There are books. It is rot." "Dad," Dante said, his voice rising. "It is old, dusty rot. $500 is better than paying a monthly fee to store garbage. We need every penny." He stood up. "Come on, he is waiting outside. Let's get this over with." We walked out into the morning chill. Parked in the driveway right behind my pristine Ford was a monstrosity of a vehicle. It was a rusted-out panel van that looked like it had survived a war zone. The muffler was held on by wire, and the side bore a hand-painted sign, "Marcus Scrap and Hauling." Leaning against the hood was Marcus. I almost broke character. I almost smiled. My friend, the distinguished historian and appraiser, looked like he had rolled in a mechanic's pit. He was wearing grease-stained overalls that were 2 sizes too big. He had a smudge of oil on his cheek and a toothpick in the corner of his mouth. He wore a dirty baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He looked magnificent. Caroline wrinkled her nose as we approached. She stayed a few feet back as if poverty were contagious. "You the lady who called about the storage unit?" Marcus asked. His voice was gravelly, a perfect affectation. "I am," Caroline said, crossing her arms. "You have the cash." Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a wad of bills. Ones, fives, a few tens. It looked like a lot of paper, but I knew it didn't add up to much. He thumbed through it, slowly licking his finger. 500 as agreed. He grunted. "Sight unseen. I take it all. The paper, the wood, whatever is in there. I clear it out today." He held the money out. "But I need the owner to sign the bill of sale," he added, nodding at me. "Transfer of ownership, to cover my back so nobody says I stole it." Caroline snatched the clipboard he was holding under his arm. It was a simple document. "I sell the contents of Unit 404 to Marcus Scrap for $500. No takebacks, no returns." She thrust the clipboard and a pen at me. "Sign it, Dad," she demanded. I looked at the paper. Then I looked at the van. Then I looked at Dante. "Son," I said, my voice trembling. "Please, let me go through it first. Just give me a week. There might be photo albums. We don't have a week, Dante shouted. He was losing it. The pressure of the debt was cracking him. We don't have a day. Sign the damn paper, Dad. It is just junk. I looked at Marcus. He stared back at me, his face impassive, but his eyes were twinkling behind the grime. It is a fair price, old-timer, Marcus said. Paper market is down. I am doing you a favor taking the wood furniture. Termites usually. Termites. He was talking about Art Deco masterpieces as if they were firewood. It was brilliant. I looked at the money in Marcus's hand. Then I looked at Caroline. $500 is nothing, I whispered. It is an insult to your mother's memory. Caroline stepped forward. She got right in my face. I could see the pores in her skin, the cruelty in her eyes. Here is the reality, Elijah, she hissed. You have $0. You are living in a house you can't afford, eating food we pay for. You want to keep that storage unit, fine. You pay the $50 a month. Do you have $50 right now? I patted my empty pockets. I looked down at my shoes. No, I said softly. Then you don't get a vote, she said. She grabbed my hand, the one holding the pen, and forced it toward the paper. Sign it. Or so help me God, I will have Dante drop you off at the homeless shelter tonight. I looked at Dante. He didn't protest. He didn't defend me. He just looked away, focusing on the horizon, waiting for the money that would save his skin for another day. That was the final straw. That was the moment any lingering guilt I had about deceiving them evaporated. They were willing to throw me on the street to cover their own sins. I pulled my hand away from Caroline's grip. I can sign my own name, I said with a flash of dignity that surprised her. I put the pen to the paper, the tip scratched against the cheap paper. Elijah Thorne. I signed it with a flourish. I handed the clipboard back to Marcus. It is yours, I said to him. Take care of it. Marcus nodded solemnly. He handed the wad of cash to Caroline. She snatched it immediately, counting it quickly. It is all there, Marcus grunted. He walked around to the back of his van and opened the doors. It was empty, ready to receive the treasure. I will head over there now, Marcus said. Keys. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the brass key. The key to Unit 404. The key to millions. I held it for a moment, feeling its weight. Caroline held out her hand. Give it to him, Elijah. I dropped the key into Marcus's dirty gloved hand. Good luck, I said. Marcus winked at me. Just a quick flicker of an eyelid that Caroline and Dante missed. Pleasure doing business, he said. He climbed into his noisy van. The engine roared to life with a cloud of black smoke that made Caroline cough and wave her hand in front of her face. We watched him back out of the driveway and rumble down the street. Caroline shoved the dirty bills into her pocket. $500, she said, sounding disappointed. Well, it pays the electric bill this month. She turned and walked back toward the house, her heels clicking on the pavement. Come on, Dante. We have to meet the realtor at 10. Dante lingered for a second. He looked at me. I am sorry, Pop, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. It had to be done. You will thank us later when everything is simplified. Simplified. That was a nice word for stripped bare. I watched him follow his wife into the house. I stayed in the driveway for a moment, listening to the fading sound of Marcus's truck. I let out a long, slow breath. The morning air suddenly felt crisp and clean. They thought they had just sold a pile of garbage to a fool. They thought they had bullied a senile old man into submission. They had no idea that I had just legally transferred the only thing of value in this family to the only person I could trust. I looked at the house. My house. They were in there right now, measuring the windows, counting the silverware, planning how to spend the money from the sale. Let them plan, I thought. Let them count. I walked back inside my step a little lighter. I went into the kitchen and poured myself another cup of coffee. It was still hot. Caroline was already on the phone with the realtor, putting on her fake charming voice. Yes, we are very motivated sellers, she was saying. We want a quick close. I sat down and took a sip of coffee. It tasted better than it had 10 minutes ago. It tasted like victory. Dante sat down across from me. He looked a little less pale now that he had seen some cash, even if it was a pitiful amount. What are you smiling about, Dad? He asked, suspicious. I hid my smile behind the mug. Oh, nothing, son, I said. I was just thinking about that junk man. Poor guy. He probably thinks he got a good deal. Dante snorted. Yeah. Idiot. He is going to spend all week hauling that trash to the dump. I nodded. Life is funny that way, Dante, I said. One man's trash is another man's retirement. He didn't get it. He just shrugged and went back to checking his crypto app. I sat there enjoying the warmth of the coffee, thinking about Marcus driving toward the old container district. I imagined him opening those boxes. I imagined him holding that Dave Drake pot. I imagined him securing the legacy of Beatrice Thorne. The first domino had fallen, and the crash was going to be spectacular. The house was vibrating. I could feel the bass of the music thumping through the floorboards of the kitchen, rattling the teacups in the cabinet Beatrice had organized by color. It was Tuesday night. Who throws a party on a Tuesday night? People who don't have to wake up for work in the morning, or people who think they have just hit the jackpot. Dante and Caroline were definitely in the second category. I sat at the small breakfast table in the corner of the kitchen, the one where Beatrice and I used to drink our morning coffee and do the crossword puzzle. I was eating a ham sandwich on a paper plate because Caroline had used all the good china for her guests. There were about 30 of them. I didn't recognize a single face. They weren't family, they weren't neighbors. They were sharks in silk and linen colleagues from Caroline's real estate firm and Dante's drinking buddies from the country club he couldn't afford. I wasn't invited to the festivities in the living room. I was explicitly told to stay out of the way. "Dad, try not to wander around," Caroline had said earlier while arranging a platter of imported cheese. "We are discussing business strategy. It would be awkward if you were shuffling around in your slippers." So I sat in the kitchen, invisible in my own home. But thanks to modern technology, I wasn't deaf and I certainly wasn't blind. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and opened the home security app. 2 days ago, while they were out meeting with lawyers, I had installed a small wireless camera on the bookshelf in the living room, tucked right between 2 encyclopedias. I told myself it was for security to catch burglars. I didn't realize the burglars would be wearing designer suits and drinking my wine. On the screen, the living room looked like a scene from a movie I would turn off after 5 minutes. The air was thick with smoke and pretension. Caroline was holding court in the center of the room, wearing a black dress that cost more than my first car. She looked triumphant. Dante was standing next to her, refilling glasses, laughing too loud at jokes that weren't funny. He looked like a man who had just escaped a firing squad and was trying to convince himself he was a hero. I turned up the volume on my phone, pressing the speaker against my ear. "So when do you break ground?" a man with slicked back hair asked. "As soon as the ink dries on the sale," Caroline answered, her voice sharp and clear through the tiny microphone. "We are listing it as a tear-down opportunity or a gut renovation. The land value alone in Bronzeville is skyrocketing. We are looking at a clear $600,000, maybe $7 if we get a bidding war. $700,000. They were talking about erasing 40 years of my life for a paycheck. "And what about the old man?" a woman asked. "The one in the red blouse. Is he okay with this?" Caroline laughed. It was a cold, dismissive sound that made my stomach turn. "Oh, Elijah. He is confused. Senile, really. We are moving him to Sun Valley next week. It is for the best. He can't manage this place. He wanders around at night talking to his dead wife. It is sad, honestly. We are doing him a kindness." I gripped my sandwich so hard the bread turned to dough in my fist. Talking to my dead wife, I spoke to Beatrice because she was the only person who ever listened to me. They called it madness. I called it love. But the worst was yet to come. Dante tapped a spoon against his wine glass. The room quieted down. "I want to make a toast," he said, swaying slightly. "To Caroline, the brains of this operation. She saved us this week." Caroline preened, soaking up the applause. "It wasn't just me," she said, feigning modesty. "Dante did the heavy lifting with the paperwork. But I have to tell you guys the funniest part of this whole nightmare." She paused for dramatic effect. The room leaned in. "So my mother-in-law, Beatrice, she was a sweet woman, but she was, simple, country. She had this obsession with saving things. We found out she had been renting a storage unit for 40 years. 40 years, someone gasped. "Yes," Caroline continued, her eyes glittering with malice. "And Elijah, poor thing, he was convinced it was full of treasure. He begged me not to sell it. He was crying, literally crying about saving the memories." She took a sip of wine, letting the suspense build. "So I went ahead and sold the contents sight unseen to a scrap dealer this morning." The room murmured. "For how much?" the slick-haired man asked. $500, Caroline announced. Laughter rippled through the room. $500 for 40 years of rent. "That is tragic," the woman in red squealed. It gets better, Caroline said, raising her voice over the laughter. The scrap guy, he was this dirty, greasy character. He drives off with the keys, and I am thinking good luck with the rats. Because you know what Beatrice was hoarding: old newspapers. And hair products. The laughter grew louder. Hair grease, Caroline shrieked. Can you imagine? She probably thought those old tins of pomade were going to come back in style. It was just junk. Ghetto junk. And Elijah is sitting there thinking we sold the crown jewels. Dante joined in the laughter. He was laughing at his mother. He was laughing at the woman who had scrubbed floors so he could have piano lessons. He was laughing at the history of his own people, reducing it to a punchline to impress a room full of people who wouldn't spit on him if he was on fire. I stared at the screen. I looked at my son's face, distorted by the pixelated feed and the alcohol. In that moment, the last thread of attachment I had to him snapped. It didn't break with a bang. It just withered and died. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is hot. Anger is passionate. What I felt was ice cold. It was the absolute clarity of a judge passing a sentence. I put the phone down on the table. I couldn't watch anymore. The ham sandwich sat there untouched. I felt a vibration against the wood of the table. A text message. I picked the phone up again. It wasn't a notification from the camera. It was a message from Marcus. I opened it. There were no emojis, no jokes. Just a photo of a document and 3 sentences. The photo showed a notarized bill of sale and a transfer of assets into a newly formed LLC called the North Star Trust. The text read, "It is done, Elijah. The unit and all its contents are now legally the property of the trust. You are the sole beneficiary. The paperwork is ironclad. Even if they sue, they can't touch a single comic book." I let out a long, slow breath. The tension that had been tightening my chest all day released. They were in the other room laughing about $500. They didn't know that $500 had just bought me freedom. They didn't know that the ghetto junk they mocked was worth more than their souls. I stood up and carried my plate to the sink. I washed it, dried it, and put it away. I wiped the table down. I moved with slow, deliberate purpose. I could hear Caroline starting another story, probably about how she was going to redecorate the master bedroom, my bedroom. "Let them laugh," I whispered to the empty kitchen. I walked to the refrigerator and took out a bottle of water. I caught my reflection in the stainless steel door. I didn't look like a confused old man. I looked like Elijah Thorne. I looked like a man who had just secured his legacy. I turned off the kitchen light, plunging the room into darkness. The only light came from the crack under the door leading to the living room where the party was raging. I walked to the back door, the one that led to the garden Beatrice had planted. I stepped out into the cool night air. The noise of the party was muffled here. I could hear the crickets. I could smell the jasmine. I looked up at the sky. "You heard them, Beatrice," I said softly. "You heard what they said about you." I took a sip of water. "Don't worry, my love. The bill is coming due, and it is going to be a lot more than $500. I went back inside and climbed the back stairs to my room. I locked the door and sat in the chair by the window. I didn't go to sleep. I just sat there listening to the music fade, waiting for the house to go quiet. Because tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tomorrow, I would stop playing defense. Tomorrow, I would start the eviction. Not of myself, but of the parasites who had infested my life. I looked at the phone one last time. Marcus's message was still there, glowing in the dark, ironclad. I smiled. It was the first genuine smile I had smiled in days. "Sleep well, Dante," I thought. "Enjoy your hangover, because you are going to need all your strength when the ground falls out from under you." Wednesday morning arrived with the stale scent of spilled Chardonnay and expensive perfume that had soured overnight. My house felt hungover. The party guests had left their mark rings on the coffee table, a red wine stain on the rug Beatrice had brought back from Morocco, and a lingering atmosphere of entitlement that hung in the air like smog. I was in the kitchen washing the few dishes I had used for my solitary breakfast when Dante walked in. He was holding a thick stack of papers in a blue folder. He looked better than he had on Monday, mostly because he thought his problems were solved. He was wearing his lucky tie, the one with the little sailboats on it. It was ironic, considering his ship was sinking and he didn't even know it. "Morning, Pop," he said, his voice breezy and confident. "Coffee fresh." "It is." I said, not turning around. He poured himself a cup and sat at the table, slapping the blue folder down on the wood. The sound echoed in the quiet room. "Big day, Dad." The realtor came through. "We have a buyer, cash offer, a developer who wants to close in 10 days. No inspection, no contingencies." I turned off the faucet and dried my hands on a dish towel. I walked over to the table and looked at the folder. "Who is the buyer?" I asked. Dante waved a hand dismissively. "Some holding company, LLC out of Delaware. Doesn't matter. The important thing is the number. They matched our asking price." He opened the folder and pushed a pen toward me. "We need your signature on the purchase agreement," he said. "Once you sign this, the clock starts. Caroline and I have already found a great suite at the Fairmont to stay in while we look for a new place, and we have reserved a room for you at Sun Valley starting next week." I pulled a chair out and sat down. I put my reading glasses on. I took my time. I read the first page. I flipped to the second. I could feel Dante's impatience radiating off him like heat from a radiator. He tapped his foot. He checked his watch. "Is there a problem?" Caroline asked from the doorway. She was already dressed, holding a designer handbag that probably cost more than the scrap value of my truck. I looked up at her over the rim of my glasses. "No problem," I said calmly. "The price seems adequate." Caroline let out a sharp breath. "Adequate." "It is a miracle, Elijah. You should be thanking us." I closed the folder. I folded my hands on top of it. "I will sign it," I said. Dante reached for the folder, smiling. "Great. I will call the but," I interrupted, holding up a finger. "I have one condition." Caroline rolled her eyes. "We don't have time for conditions, Elijah. The offer expires at 5 o'clock. This is non-negotiable," I said, my voice hardening just enough to make them pause. "Beatrice and I, we believed in certain things. The energy of a house. The spirit of a home." I looked around the kitchen. This house is full of noise right now. Full of chaos. If I am going to leave this place, if I am going to say goodbye to the home where I raised my son and loved my wife, I need to do it in peace. I need to cleanse the energy. Dante frowned. "Cleanse the energy. Like burning sage. Something like that." I lied. "But I can't do it with all of your clutter here. I can't do it with you two rushing in and out talking about money and renovations." I looked them both in the eye. "I want you to move out. Today." Caroline laughed. "Excuse me, you want us to leave? I want you to take your things, your clothes, your computers, and go to that hotel you mentioned. I want the house empty of everything except me and Beatrice's spirit for the next 3 days. Once the house is quiet, I will perform the cleansing, I will sign the final closing papers, and I will go to Sun Valley quietly." I pushed the folder toward them. "If you don't agree, I don't sign. And the deal dies." Dante looked at Caroline. I could see the wheels turning in their heads. They thought I was a superstitious old fool. They thought grief had made me eccentric. But more importantly, they saw an opportunity. They wanted to get away from me anyway. They wanted to go live in a luxury hotel and drink room service champagne without having to look at their father's judging eyes. Caroline shrugged. "Honestly, Dante, it is not a bad idea. I can't stand the draft in this house anyway. And the Fairmont has a spa." She looked at me with a smirk. "Fine, Elijah. If you want to rattle chicken bones and burn incense, be my guest. We will pack our bags. We can be out by noon." "Good," I said. "Take everything you need. I don't want to see any of your personal items when I do the ritual." We spent the next 3 hours in a strange, frenetic dance. Dante and Caroline ran around the house like looting soldiers. They packed suitcases. They packed boxes of their expensive shoes. They took the silver candlesticks from the dining room. They took the television from the den. I sat in my armchair and watched them. I watched them strip the house of everything that was theirs, everything that was modern and shallow. They didn't touch Beatrice's things. To them, her things were part of the old house that was being sold. By 1 o'clock, the hallway was lined with Louis Vuitton luggage. Dante was sweating. "That is everything," he said, wiping his forehead. "We are heading to the hotel. I will text you the address for the closing on Friday." Caroline stood by the door. She didn't hug me. She didn't say goodbye. She just checked her makeup in the hall mirror. "Don't burn the house down with your sage, Elijah," she said. I stood up and walked them to the door. "I won't," I said. "Goodbye, Caroline. Goodbye, Dante." I watched them load the car. It took them 10 minutes to fit everything into their SUV. When they finally pulled away, they didn't look back. They were too focused on the future, on the money, on the freedom they thought they had just won. I stood on the porch until their car turned the corner and disappeared. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was full. It was the silence of a deep breath before a shout. I went back inside and closed the door. I didn't lock it, not yet. I walked to the kitchen phone and dialed a number I had memorized 50 years ago. Stan, it is Elijah Thorne. Yes, I am good. Listen, I need a favor, and I need it now. Can you come over? Bring the heavy-duty deadbolts, the ones you used to install for the warehouses. And Stan, bring the drill. 20 minutes later, a white van pulled into the driveway. Stan was a man of few words and much action. He was 75 with hands like leather and a tool belt that creaked with history. He didn't ask why I was changing the locks on my own son. He just looked at the scratches on the floor where Dante had dragged his suitcases and nodded. Front and back, Stan asked. All of them, I said. Garage, side door, cellar. And the keypad on the security system. I want the code changed. What is the new code, he asked, punching the reset sequence into the panel. 1847, I said. The year the North Star was published. Stan worked for 2 hours. The sound of the drill was music to my ears. It was the sound of boundaries being drawn. It was the sound of authority being re-established. Every screw that went into the wood was a nail in the coffin of Dante's inheritance. When he was finished, Stan handed me a set of 4 shiny silver keys. They felt cool and sharp in my palm. You are locked down tight, Elijah, Stan said, wiping his hands on a rag. Nobody gets in here unless they have a battering ram or a warrant. I paid him in cash and shook his hand. Thank you, Stan. You have no idea what this means. He left, and I was alone again. But this time I wasn't invisible. I was the captain of the ship. I walked through the house. It felt different now. The negative energy Caroline had brought in, the judgment, the greed, the disrespect had left with her luggage. The house felt like mine again. It smelled like floor wax and old books. I went to the front door and threw the new deadbolt. Clack. A solid, heavy sound. I went to the back door. Clack. I stood in the center of the living room. The sun was beginning to set, casting long golden shadows across the floor. I pulled the blue folder with the purchase agreement out of the trash can where I had thrown it the moment they left. I ripped it in half, then I ripped it in half again. I walked to the fireplace. I struck a match and lit the pile of papers. I watched the flames curl around Dante's dreams of easy money. I watched the signature line turn to ash. I wasn't going to Sun Valley. I wasn't selling the house. Dante and Caroline were sitting in a hotel room right now, ordering room service, thinking they had won. They thought they had an agreement. They thought they had a home to come back to if things went wrong. They were wrong. They had checked out, and I had just made sure they could never check back in. I sat down in my armchair, the leather groaning familiarly under my weight. I poured myself a glass of bourbon neat. I raised the glass to the empty room. The energy is cleansed, Beatrice, I whispered. Now let's see how they like living in the real world. I took a sip, the burn of the alcohol matching the fire in my belly. The siege was over. The counterattack had begun. And the best part was they wouldn't even know they were homeless until they tried to put the key in the door. Thursday evening in Chicago usually meant traffic and noise, but inside the private gallery on Michigan Avenue, the world was silent and smelled of expensive furniture polish. This wasn't a public auction house with shouting auctioneers and cattle call crowds. This was a private viewing invitation only, orchestrated by Marcus with the precision of a military operation. I stood in the corner wearing a suit I hadn't worn since my retirement party 10 years ago. It felt a little loose around the waist, but my spine was stiff. I held a glass of sparkling water, watching the people filter in. They were a different breed from the people Caroline invited to her parties. Caroline's friends wore their wealth like neon signs, loud and flashy. These people whispered. They wore coats that cost more than Dante's car, but you wouldn't know it unless you touched the fabric. They were historians, archivists from the Smithsonian, and private collectors from New York and London who flew in on private jets just for tonight. And they were here for Beatrice. I walked over to a glass display case in the center of the room. Under the soft, museum-quality lighting, the items from Unit 404 didn't look like junk. They looked like holy relics. The Madam C.J.C. Walker tins were polished, glowing gold under the lights. The quilt, the one I had found balled up in a corner, was now mounted on the wall like a tapestry of kings. but the centerpiece was the letter. I looked down at it. A single sheet of paper yellowed with age protected inside a UV-resistant frame. The handwriting was looped and hurried, written in a jail cell in Birmingham. It was signed simply Martin. Beatrice had found this tucked inside a Bible she bought at a garage sale in 1982 for $2. She had kept it hidden in a box marked tax returns. Marcus walked up beside me. He looked elegant in a tuxedo, a far cry from the grease-stained mechanic he had played on Monday. "How does it feel, Elijah?" he asked softly. "It feels like justice," I whispered. The auction began without fanfare. There was no gavel banging, just a polite man at a podium speaking in a hushed, rhythmic cadence. "Lot number 1, he announced. A personal correspondence from Dr. King dated 1963. Provenance verified. Opening bid is $50,000. My heart hammered against my ribs. 50,000. That was 2 years of my pension. 50,000 from the gentleman in the back, the auctioneer said calmly. Do I hear 60, 60? 70. The numbers flew through the air, invisible but heavy. 80,000. 90. I looked at the bidders. They weren't hesitating. They knew exactly what this was. They weren't buying paper. They were buying a piece of the soul of America. $100,000. I gripped my glass tighter. Dante owed $200,000 to criminals. Half of his debt was sitting in a glass case right in front of me. 120. 130. The room went quiet. A woman in the front row, wearing pearls and a look of absolute determination, raised her paddle one last time. $150,000, the auctioneer said. Going once, going twice, sold. A polite ripple of applause moved through the room. I let out a breath. $150,000 for one letter, and we had hundreds of items left to go. The night blurred into a stream of staggering numbers. The Dave Drake pot sold for $80,000. The collection of first edition newspapers went to a university archive for $250,000. The comic books, the ones Marcus had spotted, immediately sparked a bidding war between a tech billionaire and a movie producer that ended at $600,000. By the time the final lot was sold, the room was buzzing with the kind of energy that only massive amounts of money can generate. Marcus led me into the back office. He sat behind a desk and pulled out a calculator. He tapped away for a moment, then turned the screen toward me. The number was glowing in green, $2,540,000. And this is just the first batch, Elijah Marcus said, pouring 2 glasses of scotch. We held back the furniture and the art for the spring auction. This is just the appetizer. I stared at the number, $2.5 million. 3 days ago, my daughter-in-law had threatened to put me in a state-run facility because she didn't want to pay $50 a month for storage. 3 days ago, my son had looked me in the eye and told me I had nothing to contribute. I took the glass Marcus offered. My hand was steady. The money will be wired to the trust account in the morning, Marcus said. It is untouchable, Elijah. You are a wealthy man. I took a sip of the scotch. It burned, but it was a good burn. I am not wealthy, Marcus, I said. Beatrice was wealthy. I am just the delivery service. I left the gallery around 10 o'clock. The city was alive with lights, but I didn't go home to my empty, quiet house. I had one more stop to make. I told the taxi driver to take me to the Fairmont Hotel. I needed to see them. I needed to see the people who had thrown this fortune away. I needed to see if their ignorance was truly as deep as I suspected. I found them in the hotel bar. It was a dimly lit, velvet-lined lounge that smelled of money and desperation. Dante and Caroline were sitting at a corner table. They looked out of place. They were trying too hard. Caroline was wearing too much jewelry, and Dante was drinking too fast. I walked over. They didn't see me at first. They were both staring at Caroline's tablet. Dad, Dante said, nearly spilling his drink when I tapped him on the shoulder. What are you doing here? I just wanted to drop off the spare keys. I lied smoothly, placing a set of old, useless keys on the table. For the realtor. I forgot to leave them at the house. Caroline barely looked up. She was scrolling through a news feed, her face twisted in a mixture of envy and disbelief. You won't believe this, she muttered, not even saying hello to me. Look at this article. She turned the tablet toward Dante. I leaned in to look. The headline was bold, Secret History, discovered in Chicago storage unit. The article described a mystery collection of priceless African American artifacts discovered in a dilapidated warehouse on the South Side. It mentioned the MLK letter. It mentioned the auction results. $2.5 million. Can you believe that? Caroline scoffed, taking a furious sip of her martini. Some lucky person finds a unit full of gold. Meanwhile, we get stuck with your mother's unit full of trash. Dante shook his head, looking at the picture of the Dave Drake pot in the article. $2 million for a ceramic bowl, he said, his voice thick with jealousy. Who pays that? The world is crazy. I stood there looking at them. The irony was so thick I could taste it. It tasted like metal. They were reading about their own inheritance. They were looking at pictures of the very items they had forced me to sell for $500, and they didn't recognize them. Why? Because they had never looked. They had never opened the boxes. They had never touched the history. To them, if it was dusty, it was dirt. If it was old, it was broken. Their greed had made them blind. That is incredible, I said, my voice flat. Who was the owner? It says anonymous, Caroline said, swiping the screen with an angry finger. Probably some drug dealer who forgot he stashed it there. That is how it usually goes. God, life is so unfair. We are busting our backs trying to sell that drafty old house for peanuts, and someone else literally stumbles into millions. She looked at me, then really looked at me with pure contempt. You should have collected stamps or something, Elijah. Maybe then you wouldn't be a burden on us. The insult didn't land. It passed right through me. I looked at Dante. You know, son, I said softly, sometimes the treasure is right under your nose, but you are too busy looking at yourself to see it. He frowned. What is that supposed to mean? Nothing, I said. Just an old man's rambling. I turned to leave. By the way, I said, pausing, I cleared the negative energy from the house. It is very quiet now. Good, Caroline said, dismissing me. We will send the movers for the rest of the furniture on Friday. I walked out of the hotel bar. I walked through the opulent lobby and out into the cool night air. Caroline had read the article, she had seen the numbers, and she still didn't know. She was so convinced of her own superiority, so convinced that Beatrice was a simpleton and I was a fool, that the thought never even crossed her mind. She thought she had sold trash. I hailed a taxi. As I climbed in, I allowed myself to laugh. It started as a chuckle and grew into a deep, belly-shaking laugh that made the driver look at me in the rearview mirror. You okay, buddy? He asked. I am better than okay, I said, wiping a tear from my eye. I just watched a couple of people burn a winning lottery ticket because they didn't like the color of the paper. The taxi pulled away. I looked back at the hotel one last time. Enjoy the champagne, Caroline. Enjoy the hotel sheets. Because when Friday comes, you are going to find out that the only thing you own is your arrogance. And that doesn't sell for much on the open market, $2.5 million. And the eviction notice was already drafted in my mind. The game wasn't over. It was just getting interesting. The house was quiet, disturbingly so. It was the silence of a held breath. I sat at my dining room table, the morning sun casting long, sharp shadows across the polished wood. In front of me sat a cardboard box marked simply, personal, in Beatrice's handwriting. Marcus had brought it over the night before, separate from the auction items. You need to read this yourself, Elijah, he had said, his eyes filled with a sadness I didn't understand at the time. There are things in there that aren't for the history books. I reached into the box. It wasn't full of antique newspapers or rare pottery. It was full of the mundane paper trail of a life lived in secret. Bank statements from accounts I didn't know existed, receipts for the storage unit, and at the bottom a leather-bound journal, its cover worn soft by the touch of her hands. I poured myself a cup of coffee, my hand shaking slightly. I opened the journal. Beatrice had never been one for pouring her heart out on paper. She was a private woman. But as I turned the pages, I realized this wasn't a diary of emotions. It was a ledger of sins. The entries started 10 years ago. I remembered that year. It was the year Dante had claimed he was starting his own architectural firm. It was the year he had come to us beaming with pride, saying he had secured a massive contract, but just needed a little bridge loan for equipment. We had given him $10,000. I thought that was the end of it. I turned to the entry dated October 14th, 2014. The money is gone from the emergency fund, Beatrice wrote. Her handwriting was jagged, pressed hard into the paper. $20,000. I went to the bank today to withdraw cash for the boiler repair, and the teller told me the account was empty. Withdrawal made by Dante Thorne. He forged my signature. I stopped reading. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Forged my son, I read on. I confronted him. He cried. He said the investors pulled out. He said he would go to jail if he didn't pay a vendor. He begged me not to tell Elijah. He said it would kill his father to know his son is a thief, so I will handle it. I pawned my emerald necklace today, the one Elijah gave me for our 25th anniversary. I told Elijah I lost it at the grocery store. He looked so sad, but he forgave me. I hate lying to him, but I cannot break his heart with the truth about his son. I closed my eyes. The emerald necklace. I remembered that day. She had come home in tears, searching her purse, searching the car. I had held her, telling her it was just a thing, that she was all that mattered. She hadn't lost it. She had sold it to cover Dante's crime. A wave of nausea rolled over me. I wasn't just grieving a wife. I was grieving an illusion. The son I thought was just bad with money was a criminal who had preyed on his own mother's love. But the journal wasn't finished. I turned the pages faster now, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The entries became sporadic, but the theme was constant. Small loans that were never repaid. Lies about business trips. Then I found a manila envelope tucked into the back cover. It was thick. On the front, Beatrice had written the truth about 2023. I opened the clasp. Photos spilled out onto the table. They weren't photos of buildings. They weren't photos of job sites. They were photos of Dante. But he wasn't with Caroline. He wasn't at his office. He was sitting at an outdoor cafe in Miami wearing sunglasses and a linen shirt I had never seen. Across from him was a woman. She was young, maybe 25. Blonde. Very pretty. In another photo, he was handing her a set of keys to a car, a red convertible. I picked up a document stapled to the photos. It was a report from a private investigator. Beatrice had hired a PI. My frugal history teacher wife had hired a private eye. The report was clinical, brutal in its facts. Subject Dante Thorne. Observation period January 2023 to present. Findings. Subject maintains a secondary residence in South Loop. Lease is in the name of Miss Jessica Vane. Monthly rent $4,500. Subject provides monthly allowance of $3,000. Subject recently purchased a 2022 Mercedes-Benz for Miss Vane. I looked at the dates. These expenses, the apartment, the car, the allowance, they coincided perfectly with the times Dante had come to us crying poverty. Pop, the market is tough. Pop, inflation is killing my margins. Pop, we can't afford the heating bill this month. He wasn't broke. He was funding a double life. I looked at the final page of the report. It outlined his current financial status. Subject has engaged in high-risk borrowing from unregulated lenders, loan sharks, to maintain payments for both his marital home and the secondary residence. Total estimated debt to unregulated lenders, $215,000. The $200,000. Caroline thought it was for crypto. She thought he was a fool who made a bad investment in Bitcoin. She was selling my house, selling her mother-in-law's legacy, stripping me bare, all to save her husband from a business mistake. She didn't know she was selling my home to pay for his mistress. I sat back in my chair. The silence of the house was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with the weight of this betrayal. It felt toxic. I looked at the photos again. Dante laughing, Dante playing the big shot, Dante spending his mother's life savings on a stranger while his mother lay dying in a hospital bed. And Caroline, the woman who sneered at me, who called my wife's treasures garbage, who treated me like a nuisance. She was a victim too, in a way, a victim of the same man who was bleeding me dry. But I felt no pity for her, not yet. Her arrogance had made her an accomplice. She was so busy looking down on me that she didn't see the snake in her own bed. My phone buzzed on the table, shattering the moment. It was Dante. I looked at the name on the screen. Son. I used to smile when I saw that name. Now it looked like a threat. I picked up the phone. I didn't say hello. Yeah, I said, my voice gravel. Pop, it is Dante. Listen about the movers. They are coming tomorrow at 8. Are you ready? Is the house cleansed? He chuckled nervously at the end, mocking my request for a spiritual cleansing. It is clean, Dante, I said. Cleaner than you can imagine. Good. Good. Listen, Dad. I need a favor. The closing is scheduled for Friday afternoon, right? But the buyer needs a preliminary document signed today to release the funds into escrow. Can I swing by and get your signature? It is just a formality. A formality. Just like the forged signature on the bank withdrawal 10 years ago. Just like the lies about the emerald necklace. There was a time, maybe just an hour ago, when I might have felt a twinge of guilt about what I was going to do to him. I might have worried that I was being too harsh, that leaving him homeless was too cruel. But looking at the photo of him laughing in Miami while his mother was pawning her jewelry, that guilt evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I am not home. Dante, I lied. I am at the library. Oh, okay. Well, can I meet you there? It is really urgent, Pop. No, I said. I will see you on Friday at the house. At the closing, not a minute sooner. But I hung up. I looked at the diary one last time. Beatrice had carried this burden alone. She had protected me from the truth because she wanted me to keep loving my son. She wanted to preserve the image of the family she had worked so hard to build. But Beatrice was gone, and the protection period was over. I stood up and walked to the fireplace. It was cold and empty, just swept clean by the chimney sweep I had hired on Tuesday. I took the photos of Dante and his mistress. I took the PI report. I held them in my hand. Part of me wanted to show them to Caroline, to watch her face crumble, to watch her turn on him. It would be an easy revenge. But no, that was too quick. That was too merciful. If I told Caroline now, she might divorce him, but she would still try to sell my house to save herself. She would still try to claim the assets. I needed them together. I needed them bound together in their greed and their ignorance until the trap snapped shut. I put the documents back in the envelope and walked to the wall safe behind the painting in the study, the one safe Dante didn't know the combination to because Beatrice had changed it. I locked the evidence inside. I wouldn't use the treasure to pay his debt. I wouldn't use a single dime of Madam C.J. Walker's legacy to pay for his Mercedes-Benz or his mistress's apartment. Let the loan sharks come. Let the walls close in. I walked into the kitchen and opened the fridge. It was nearly empty, just how I liked it. I took out a jar of pickles and ate one, enjoying the sour crunch. Dante had stolen $20,000 from us 10 years ago. With interest and with the price of a mother's broken heart, the debt he owed was incalculable. But on Friday, I would start collecting. I looked at the calendar on the wall. Beatrice had circled Friday's date months ago. It was supposed to be our anniversary dinner. Now it was going to be Judgment Day. I realized then that I wasn't just angry. I was liberated. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to worry about Dante's future. He had bought his future one lie at a time. Now he just had to live in it. I went upstairs to prepare my suit for Friday. I chose the black one, the one I wore to funerals, because in a way I was going to a funeral. I was going to bury the last remnant of the father who enabled a monster, and from the grave, Beatrice was handing me the shovel. Friday morning broke with a sky the color of bruised iron. It was the kind of Chicago morning that warned you to stay inside, but inside my house, the air was warm and smelled of cinnamon and victory. This was supposed to be the day of the closing. This was the day Dante and Caroline had circled in red ink on their calendar, the day they thought they would hand over the keys to my home to a developer and walk away with a check that would erase their sins. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had signed the bill of sale for $500 just 4 days ago. In front of me lay a fresh copy of the Chicago Tribune. I hadn't even unfolded it yet. I just stared at the masthead, feeling the weight of the paper in my hands. I knew what was inside. Marcus had texted me at midnight to tell me the story had broken. I took a sip of coffee, savoring the bitterness, and flipped the paper open. There she was. Taking up the entire top half of the front page was a black and white photograph of Beatrice. It was a picture I had taken myself in 1974. She was standing in front of the Lincoln Memorial, her hair wrapped in a silk scarf, smiling that secret smile of hers that always made me feel like I was the only man on earth. The headline was bold black and impossible to ignore. The hidden treasure of Bronzeville $1 Million Black History Archive discovered in forgotten storage unit. I read the words and my vision blurred with tears. They weren't calling it junk. They weren't calling it hoarding. They were calling it a treasure. The article described the collection in breathless detail: the Dave Drake pottery, the Frederick Douglass newspapers, the first edition comic books. It estimated the total value of the collection at over $5 million, with the first auction netting nearly $3 million. And there, in the third paragraph, was the sentence that I knew would trigger the explosion. The collection was authenticated and curated by renowned historian and antique expert Mr. Marcus Sterling, who secured the items from a private estate earlier this week. Marcus Sterling. Not Marcus the scrap man, not Marcus the junk hauler. Marcus Sterling, the man whose name commanded respect in every museum from here to D.C. I put the paper down. I looked at the clock. It was 8:15. At that exact moment, 5 miles away in the plush dining room of the Fairmont Hotel, I knew exactly what was happening. I could picture it as clearly as if I were watching it on a screen. Dante and Caroline would be sitting at a white-clothed table. Dante would be nursing a hangover and a coffee, trying to ignore the looming deadline of his debt. Caroline would be eating something expensive, scrolling through her phone or reading the complimentary newspaper provided by the hotel. I imagined Caroline picking up the Tribune. I imagined her eyes scanning the headline. I imagined the moment of confusion followed by the shock of recognition. Beatrice's face, her mother-in-law, the woman she had mocked, the woman she had called simple. Then she would read the name, Marcus Sterling. She would freeze. Her mind would race back to Monday morning. The dirty van, the grease-stained overalls, the man who had called himself simply Marcus, the man she had sneered at, the man she had sold the unit to for $500. The realization wouldn't come as a thought. It would come as a physical blow. She had held a winning lottery ticket in her hand, and she had sold it for the price of a pair of shoes. I didn't have to wait long to confirm my theory. At 8:45, the silence of my street was shattered. It wasn't just a car arriving. It was an assault. I heard the roar of an engine being pushed to its limit, followed by the sickening screech of tires locking up on pavement. A car door slammed so hard I felt the vibration in the floorboards. Then another slam. Then came the screaming. "Elijah, open this door. Open it now." It was Caroline. Her voice wasn't the sickly sweet, manipulative tone she usually used with me. It was raw, guttural, stripped of all pretense. It was the sound of a wounded animal that wants to bite. I didn't move from my chair. I took another sip of coffee. The pounding started, fists hammering against the heavy oak of the front door. "Dad, open up. We know you are in there." That was Dante. He sounded terrified. I stood up slowly. I buttoned my cardigan. I walked down the hallway, not rushing. The pounding was getting louder. They were kicking the door now. I stopped in the living room and looked out the bay window. It was a scene of absolute chaos. Dante's luxury SUV was parked crookedly on the lawn, tearing up the grass Beatrice had planted. Caroline was on the porch, hammering on the door with both fists. Her hair was wild, her expensive coat hanging off one shoulder. She looked deranged. Dante was pacing behind her, holding the newspaper in a clenched fist, shaking it at the house, as if the paper itself were a weapon. I walked to the door. I didn't unlock it. I just pulled back the curtain of the small window set into the wood. Caroline saw me. Her eyes went wide, filled with a mixture of rage and disbelief. You knew she screamed, her face pressing against the glass. "You old fraud, you knew what was in there." I looked at her calmly. I didn't say a word. She rattled the doorknob. She threw her shoulder against the wood. But the new deadbolts Stan had installed held firm. They didn't budge a millimeter. "Open the door, Elijah!" she shrieked. "You scammed us. That is our money." Beatrice was my mother-in-law. That inheritance belongs to the family. I leaned closer to the glass. "I sold it." "Caroline," I said, my voice muffled by the thick door, but loud enough for her to hear. "I sold it to Marcus Scrap, just like you told me to." "Liar," she screamed, spitting on the window. "That wasn't a scrap dealer, that was Marcus Sterling. He is a historian. You set us up. You and that con artist friend of yours." Dante pushed her aside and pressed his face to the glass. He looked awful. Sweat was pouring down his face despite the cold. "Pop, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "You have to let us in. We saw the paper. $2.5 million. Pop, you can't keep that. I have people coming for me. Real bad people. They are going to hurt me, Dad." I looked at my son. I looked at the fear in his eyes. 10 years ago, that look would have made me open the door. 10 years ago, I would have handed him the world to stop him from hurting. But then I remembered the photos in the safe. I remembered the emerald necklace. I remembered the apartment in the South Loop and the red Mercedes. You should have thought about that before you tried to sell my house, Dante, I said. Caroline was hysterical now. She was clawing at the doorframe. That bill of sale is void, she yelled. We will sue you. We will sue Marcus. You signed that under duress. We were trying to help you. Help me, I asked. You were trying to bury me. You were trying to erase Beatrice. I unlocked the deadlock, just the top one, and heard the heavy click. They stopped moving, thinking I was letting them in. I opened the door 2 inches, keeping the security chain tight. Get off my porch, I said. Caroline tried to shove her hand through the gap. Give me the check, she screamed. You have the money. I know you have it. We are legally entitled to half. We are the heirs. You are entitled to exactly what you signed for, I said coldly. $500, and since you already spent it, I suggest you leave. Dante dropped to his knees on the porch. He was sobbing now. A grown man weeping in front of his father and the neighbors who were starting to peek out from behind their curtains. Dad, don't do this, he cried. They will kill me. It is 200 grand pop. Just give me that. You can keep the rest. Just pay off the debt. Please. For Mom. I looked down at him. The mention of his mother hardened my heart like stone. For Mom, I repeated. You stole from your mother, Dante. You stole her jewelry. You stole her savings. And you used it to buy a car for a girl in Miami. Dante stopped crying. He looked up, his face draining of color. He looked like he had seen a ghost. How do you know about that? He whispered. Caroline froze. She turned slowly to look at Dante. Miami, she asked. Her voice was quiet, dangerous. What is he talking about, Dante? What girl in Miami? I saw the panic in Dante's eyes. He was trapped between a father who knew his secrets and a wife who controlled his life. I stepped back and started to close the door. I read her diary, Dante, I said through the crack. And I have the pictures. I slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt. Clack. I heard Caroline scream. But this time she wasn't screaming at me. What girl, Dante, she shrieked. You told me the money was for crypto. You told me we lost it in the crash. I heard the sound of a slap, sharp and loud, then another. I walked away from the door. I walked back to the kitchen. Outside, the screaming continued. Caroline was raging. Dante was begging. It sounded like a pack of wolves turning on each other. I sat back down at the table. My coffee was still warm. I picked up the newspaper again. I looked at Beatrice's face. They are here, Beatrice, I whispered, and they are tearing each other apart, just like you knew they would. I could hear Caroline pounding on the door again, but the rhythm was different. She was kicking it. I am calling the police, she screamed. You stole our inheritance. I am calling the cops. Go ahead, I thought. Call them. I took out my phone and sent a text to Marcus. They are here. They know. Let the games begin. I watched the steam rise from my cup. I felt a strange sense of peace. The storm was raging on my front porch, but inside I was safe. I was fortified. Let them scream. Let them bang on the door until their knuckles bled. They weren't getting in. Not into my house. Not into my bank account. And certainly not back into my heart. The door shook again with a violent thud. I turned the page of the newspaper to the sports section. The Bulls were playing tonight. I decided I would watch the game. Whatever was happening on my porch was no longer my family business. It was just noise. And I had learned finally how to tune it out. The red and blue lights of the police cruisers strobed against the front window, turning my living room into a disorienting disco of emergency colors. The neighbors were all out now. Mrs. Higgins from across the street was standing on her porch in her bathrobe holding her cat. The mailman had stopped his truck. It was a spectacle. Caroline had finally done it. She had called the police on her own father-in-law. I watched through the sheer curtains as 2 officers stepped out of their vehicle. One was a young rookie looking nervous. The other was older, a sergeant with a gray mustache and eyes that had seen every kind of domestic dispute Chicago had to offer. Caroline ran toward them. The transformation was Oscar-worthy. Gone was the screeching banshee who had been kicking my door 5 minutes ago. In her place was a distraught, terrified woman. She was sobbing, pointing at my house, wringing her hands in a performance of absolute victimhood. I couldn't hear exactly what she was saying through the glass, but I could read her body language. She touched her chest. She pointed to her head. She pointed to Dante, who was standing by the car looking like a man awaiting execution. She was telling them I was dangerous. She was telling them I was crazy. I checked my appearance in the hallway mirror. My tie was straight. My shirt was crisp. I looked like a man in control of his faculties. I walked to the kitchen and picked up the single most important piece of paper in this entire drama. It wasn't the newspaper article about the millions. It was the clipboard Caroline had forced into my hands on Monday morning. I unlocked the front door. The heavy click of the deadbolt echoed in the silence. I stepped out onto the porch. The cold wind hit my face, but I didn't flinch. "Sir, keep your hands where I can see them," the young officer shouted, his hand resting on his holster. Caroline let out a theatrical gasp and hid behind the sergeant. "He is having an episode," she cried out, her voice trembling perfectly. "Officer, please be careful. He is confused. He doesn't know who we are. He thinks we are trying to rob him." I raised my hands slowly, palms open. I walked to the edge of the porch steps and stopped. "I am not confused, officer," I said. My voice was calm, deep, and steady. "It carried over the wind, and I know exactly who they are. That is my son Dante and his wife Caroline, and they are trespassing." The sergeant walked up the driveway, stepping over the tire tracks Dante had left on the lawn. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at me. He looked at my clear eyes. He looked at my steady hands. He didn't see a senile old man. He saw a homeowner. "Sir, we received a call about a disturbance," the sergeant said. "This lady claims you have locked them out of their own property and that you have illegally appropriated assets belonging to the family estate. She claims you are suffering from dementia and are being taken advantage of by a third party." I looked at Caroline. She was wiping fake tears from her cheeks, nodding vigorously. "He is sick, officer," she sobbed. "He sold family heirlooms worth millions of dollars to a con artist. He didn't know what he was doing. We have power of attorney. We need to get into the house to secure his medication and the rest of the assets." "Power of attorney?" I asked. I reached into my jacket pocket. The rookie tensed up, but I moved slowly. I pulled out the folded document Dante had tried to get me to sign in the bedroom, the one I had swapped for the homestead exemption form. "I don't think you have power of attorney, Caroline," I said. "I think you have a tax renewal form." Caroline's face went pale. She stopped crying instantly. The sergeant looked back and forth between us. He sensed the shift. He knew this wasn't a medical emergency. This was a money fight. "Ma'am, do you have legal documentation proving guardianship?" the sergeant asked her. "Well, not on me," Caroline stammered. "It is in the house. He locked us out. He is stealing our inheritance. Arrest him. He is committing grand larceny right now." I walked down one step. I held out the clipboard I had brought from the kitchen. "Officer," I said, ignoring her, "there is no larceny here. There is simply a business transaction that my daughter-in-law now regrets." The sergeant took the clipboard. He adjusted his glasses and clicked on his flashlight to read the document attached to it. "What is this?" he asked. That I said, pointing to Caroline, is a bill of sale, drafted by that woman right there, dated last Monday. Caroline lunged forward. "That is void," she shrieked. He was under duress. "We didn't know the value. It is fraud." The sergeant held up a hand to silence her. He read the document aloud, his voice flat and official. "I, Elijah Thorne, hereby sell, transfer, and convey all rights, title, and interest in the contents of Storage Unit 4, 04 to Marcus Scrap and Hauling." He paused and looked closer. "Buyer accepts all items in as-is condition. Seller makes no warranties regarding the value or condition of the contents. This sale is final. Total purchase price, $500. The sergeant looked up. He looked at Caroline. "You wrote this?" he asked. Caroline's mouth opened and closed like a fish on a dock. I drafted it, yes, but we thought it was trash. We thought it was just old newspapers. We didn't know there were historical artifacts in there that constitutes fraud by omission." He didn't tell us. I smiled. It was a small, cold smile. "I begged you not to sell it." "Caroline," I said softly, "I stood in the kitchen and I begged you. I told you there were memories in there. I told you Beatrice collected things. I asked for a week to sort through it. I looked at the sergeant, and she told me that if I didn't sign that paper, she would put me in a homeless shelter. She told me I had to choose between selling the unit or being evicted." The neighbors gasped. Mrs. Higgins covered her mouth with her hand. "That is a lie," Dante shouted, stepping forward for the first time. "We never said that I looked at my son." Do you want me to pull the security camera footage from the kitchen, Dante? I asked. The one I installed last week. Dante froze. He looked at the house. He looked at the little black dot on the bookshelf through the window. He collapsed in on himself, his shoulders slumping. He knew. He knew I had them. The sergeant handed the clipboard back to me. He shook his head. He looked at Caroline with a mixture of annoyance and disgust. "Ma'am, this isn't a police matter," he said firmly. "This is a civil contract. You drafted it. You set the price. You forced the sale. Just because you made a bad deal doesn't mean a crime was committed. Seller's remorse is not grounds for arrest." "But it is millions of dollars," Caroline screamed, losing all control. "That is my money. That is my house." The sergeant stepped between her and me. "Actually, ma'am, according to the deed record I pulled up on the way over, this house belongs to Elijah Thorne. And since he has asked you to leave, you are currently trespassing." Caroline looked at the officer as if he had slapped her. "You are kicking us out!" she screeched. "We are the victims here. You are disturbing the peace," the sergeant said, his hand resting on his belt. "And you are harassing a senior citizen. Now I am going to ask you one time to get in your vehicle and leave this property. If I have to ask you a second time, you will be leaving in the back of my cruiser." Dante grabbed Caroline's arm. She tried to shake him off, her eyes wild, staring at the front door as if she could burn it down with her gaze. "Come on, Caroline," Dante whispered urgently. "We have to go, now." She looked at him, then she looked at me. The hatred in her eyes was toxic, but beneath it I saw the terror. She realized finally that the power had shifted. She wasn't the queen of the estate anymore. She was just a trespasser on a lawn she didn't own. "You will hear from my lawyer Elijah," she spat out. "This isn't over. I will drag you through every court in this state." I stood tall on the steps. I didn't flinch. "You can try, Caroline," I said. "But lawyers cost money. And last time I checked, you spent your $500 on a hotel room." She let out a scream of frustration that sounded more animal than human. She spun around and marched to the SUV, her heels sinking into the soft mud of the lawn. Dante lingered for a second. He looked up at me. His eyes were wet. "Dad," he whispered, "I don't have anywhere to go. The hotel, our credit cards were declined this morning." I looked at the son I had raised. I looked at the man who had stolen from his mother. "You have a car, Dante," I said. "It has a back seat." I turned my back on him. I walked to the front door and opened it. "Wait," Dante called out. "Dad, just tell me one thing. Did you know how much it was worth when you signed?" I stopped. I didn't turn around. "I knew exactly what it was worth, Dante," I said over my shoulder. "And I knew exactly what you were worth. That is why I signed." I stepped inside and closed the door. I threw the deadbolt. Clack. I leaned against the wood, listening. I heard the car door slam. I heard the engine start. I heard the tires squeal as they reversed out of the driveway. Then the sound of the engine faded down the street, followed by the police cruiser escorting them away. Silence returned to the house. I walked into the living room and sat down in my chair. My hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the kill. It was done. The confrontation I had dreaded and desired was over. They were gone. I looked at the empty space on the wall where Caroline had talked about knocking down a partition. I looked at the floor where she had planned to lay cheap laminate. The house was safe. The legacy was safe. I closed my eyes and let out a long breath. I could hear the ghost of Beatrice's laughter in the room. She would have hated the shouting, but she would have loved the justice. I wasn't just an old man anymore. I was a fortress. And the siege was officially broken. But the war wasn't over. Caroline was litigious and Dante was desperate. They would come back. Not with fists, but with writs and subpoenas. Let them come. I had Marcus. I had the truth. And I had $2.5 million in a trust fund that was ready to fight back. I stood up and walked to the kitchen. I was hungry. I decided I would make pancakes. Beatrice's recipe. The kind with the extra vanilla. I deserved a good breakfast. After all, I had just taken out the trash. The streetlights flickered on, casting long, skeletal shadows across the lawn that Dante had ruined with his tires just hours earlier. Inside the house, the silence was no longer empty. It was fortified. I sat in the front hallway, the lights turned off, watching the street through the peephole. I knew he would come back. A rat always returns to the ship it abandoned when the water starts rising, hoping for one last piece of wood to cling to. It was past midnight when I saw him. He didn't pull up in a car this time. He was on foot, walking quickly, hunching his shoulders as if expecting a blow from behind. He looked nothing like the arrogant man who had sipped wine in my living room and laughed about sending me to a nursing home. He looked like a fugitive. His expensive suit was rumpled, his tie was gone, and he kept checking the shadows behind him. He didn't come to the front door. He went to the iron gate at the end of the driveway, the heavy security gate I had locked earlier. He grabbed the bars, shaking them. "Dad," he whispered. His voice was a harsh rasp in the quiet night. "Dad, are you there?" I let him wait. I let the cold wind bite through his thin shirt. I let him feel the isolation he had planned for me. Then slowly, I opened the front door and walked down the driveway. I didn't rush. I didn't. I walked with the measured pace of a man who owns the ground he stands on. Dante saw me coming. He pressed his face against the cold iron bars. "Oh, thank God," he sobbed. "Dad, please. Open the gate. You have to let me in. They are looking for me." I saw a car following me for the last 3 blocks. I stopped 5 feet from the gate. I stood in the pool of light from the street lamp, letting him see me clearly. I wanted him to see the face of the father he had betrayed. "Who is following you, Dante?" I asked. My voice was low, devoid of the warmth he was used to. "The guys I owe," he stammered, his eyes darting around wildly. "The loan sharks. They know Dad. They saw the article in the Tribune. They know the family has money now. They increased the interest. They said if I don't pay by morning, they are going to break my legs." He gripped the bars tighter, his knuckles white. "Dad, you have millions now. $2.5 million. I just need 200,000. It is less than 10%. It is nothing to you. Just write a check, please. Save my life." I looked at him. I looked at the sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill. I looked at the sheer terror in his eyes, and I felt nothing. No pity, no urge to protect him. The fatherly instinct that had driven me for 40 years was dead. It had died the moment I opened Beatrice's diary. "It is not my money, Dante," I said calmly. "It belongs to the trust." He let out a hysterical laugh. "The trust. You control the trust. You are the beneficiary. You can do whatever you want. Don't lie to me. You are just punishing me because I tried to sell the house. I am sorry." "Okay, I am sorry. I was desperate." "Desperate," I repeated. I reached into the deep pocket of my wool coat. I didn't pull out a checkbook. I pulled out the leather-bound book I had spent the morning reading, Beatrice's diary. I stepped closer to the gate. "Do you recognize this?" I asked. Dante squinted in the dim light. "No. What is that?" "It is your mother's diary," I said. I saw a flicker of confusion in his eyes, followed by a dawn of dread. I tossed the book through the bars. It landed on the pavement at his feet with a heavy thud. "Pick it up," I ordered. Dante hesitated, then crouched down and picked it up. His hands were shaking so hard, he almost dropped it. "Open it to October 14th, 2014, I said. He fumbled with the pages. He didn't want to look, but my gaze pinned him to the spot. He found the page. He read it. I watched his lips move as he scanned his mother's handwriting. I watched the color drain from his face until he looked like a corpse. "The emerald necklace," I said, my voice cutting through the night like a blade. "She didn't lose it. You stole it." Dante looked up, tears streaming down his face. "Dad, I was young. I was in trouble. You were 30 years old," I corrected him, "and you let your mother think she was losing her mind. You let her cry in my arms because she thought she had been careless. You let her pawn the rest of her jewelry to cover your theft because you were too much of a coward to own up to your mistakes." I took a step closer to the bars. "And it didn't stop there, did it? The business loans, the emergency funds, and now this, $200,000. Dante dropped the diary. He grabbed the bars again. I learned my lesson. "I swear, this is the last time. I just need a clean slate." I laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. A clean slate. "You don't want a clean slate, Dante. You want a bailout. You want to use the money your mother saved by scrimping on groceries to pay for your mistakes." I pulled the envelope of photos from my pocket. I didn't throw these. I held them up. The picture of the red Mercedes. The picture of the blonde woman in Miami. Is this your mistake, Dante? I asked. Is Miss Jessica Vane a mistake? Or is she the reason you couldn't pay your mortgage? Dante fell back as if I had physically struck him. He staggered away from the gate, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. You know, he whispered. I know everything I said. I know that you didn't lose money in crypto. I know you didn't have a bad business year. I know that you have been siphoning money from this family to fund a lifestyle you didn't earn while your wife was planning to put me in a state-run facility to save $50 a month. Dante looked at the photos, then at me. The realization hit him. There was no way out. No lie could cover this. Dad, please, he whispered, dropping to his knees on the concrete. They will kill me. I looked down at him. Then maybe you should have spent less time in Miami and more time being a man, I said. I put the photos back in my pocket. You mentioned the millions of dollars, Dante. You are right. There is a lot of money. But you are wrong about one thing. It is not for you. Dante looked up, hope flickering and dying in an instant. What I am setting up the Beatrice Thorne Foundation, I said. We are building a library in Bronzeville, a center for African American history. We are going to teach young men how to build things, how to preserve their heritage, and how to be men of honor. I paused, letting the words sink in. Every single cent from that storage unit is going to that library. The library will bear your mother's name. But you won't even be allowed in the building. Dante stared at me. The cruelty of it, the justice of it stunned him. The money was there. It was real. And it was going to be used to honor the woman he had stolen from by excluding the son who had betrayed her. Dad, no. You can't. I can. I said. And I have. The papers were signed an hour ago. I turned my back on him. Dad. Wait. Where am I supposed to go? I stopped and looked back over my shoulder. I don't know, Dante, but I suggest you start running, because if those men are as close as you say, you are wasting time talking to me. I walked back up the driveway. Dad. Dad. Open the gate. His screams followed me. He was rattling the bars now, shaking the iron with the desperation of a trapped animal. Dad. I reached the front door. I stepped inside. I closed the heavy oak door and locked it. The sound of his screaming was muffled, turning into a dull, rhythmic thumping that faded into the background of the house. I walked into the living room and sat down. I didn't feel happy. No father feels happy condemning his son. But I felt clean. I felt like a surgeon who had finally cut out the rot that was killing the patient. I picked up the phone and dialed Marcus. It is done, I said. Is he gone? Marcus asked. He is outside, I said. He knows about the library, he knows about the diary and the loan sharks. That is between him and the streets, I said. I hung up. I sat there in the dark, listening to the silence return. Dante had stopped screaming. Maybe he had run. Maybe he was still there, weeping on the pavement. It didn't matter. He was on the other side of the gate. For the first time in 40 years, my house was just mine. The ghosts of his lies were gone. Only the truth remained. And the truth I discovered was a very quiet companion. I looked at the portrait of Beatrice on the mantelpiece. We are building you a library, my love, I whispered. A place where history is safe. A place where thieves can't enter. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance. I didn't flinch. I just closed my eyes and finally truly rested. The courtroom smelled of floor wax and old lies. It was a smell I had become familiar with over my 73 years, usually when dealing with city permits or parking tickets, but today the stakes were infinitely higher. Today the air was thick with the scent of Caroline's desperation. She sat at the plaintiff's table dressed in a soft powder blue suit that screamed innocence. Her hair was pulled back in a modest bun and she wore minimal makeup. She looked nothing like the woman who had screamed on my front porch or the woman who had laughed about selling my wife's legacy for scrap. Today she was playing the role of the concerned, heartbroken daughter-in-law fighting to save her poor, senile father-in-law from the clutches of a con artist. Her lawyer was a man named Prescott, a shark with a smile that cost more than my first house. He moved around the courtroom with the confidence of a man who had already bought the victory. I sat at the defense table next to my attorney, a sharp, quiet woman named Sarah and Marcus. We didn't look worried. We didn't look like victims. We looked like people who were waiting for the punchline of a very long, very bad joke. The Honorable Judge Reynolds entered the room. He was a stern man with silver hair and eyes that looked like they could spot a lie from a mile away. He banged his gavel, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. Docket number 404, the clerk announced. The estate of Thorne versus Thorne and Sterling. Caroline took the stand first. This was her moment. She pulled a tissue from her sleeve before the first question was even asked. Mrs. Thorne Prescott began, his voice dripping with sympathetic honey. "Can you tell the court why we are here today?" Caroline sniffled. She looked at the judge, then at the jury, her eyes wide and glistening. "We are here because my father-in-law Elijah is not well," she began, her voice trembling. "Since his wife passed away, his mental state has deteriorated rapidly. He forgets things. He talks to people who aren't there. He wanders the streets at night." She dabbed her eyes. "My husband and I, we tried to protect him. We tried to manage his affairs so he wouldn't be taken advantage of. But then this man showed up." She pointed a shaking finger at Marcus. "Mr. Sterling. He posed as a junk hauler. He tricked Elijah into signing away a storage unit that belonged to the family. He knew Elijah didn't understand the value. He knew Elijah thought he was just clearing out old newspapers. It was predation, Your Honor, pure and simple. We are just asking for the return of the family assets so they can be properly managed for Elijah's care." The performance was flawless. If I hadn't been the man she was talking about, I might have believed her. The jury looked at me with pity. They looked at Marcus with suspicion. A poor old man swindled out of millions. It was a story everyone wanted to believe because it had a clear villain. Prescott continued to lead her through a garden of lies. She claimed she had begged me to keep the unit. She claimed she had offered to pay for an appraisal. She claimed that I had signed the bill of sale in a moment of confusion, thinking I was signing a grocery receipt. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. You could hear a pin drop. Caroline looked down at her hands, the picture of tragic grace. "Sarah." My lawyer stood up. She didn't have a flashy suit. She didn't have a booming voice. She had a laptop and a remote control. "Mrs. Thorne," Sarah said, walking toward the witness stand. "You stated under oath that you tried to protect Elijah's assets, that you valued the contents of the storage unit but were overruled by a confused old man. Is that correct?" "Yes," Caroline said, lifting her chin slightly. "That is correct. And you stated that you had no idea Mr. Sterling was an antiques expert. That you thought he was a simple scrap dealer." "Absolutely," Caroline said. "If I had known, I never would have let him near my father-in-law." Sarah nodded. She walked back to the table and plugged her laptop into the courtroom's projection system. A large screen descended from the ceiling behind the judge. "Your Honor," Sarah said, "the defense would like to enter Exhibit A into evidence. This is security camera footage taken from the kitchen of Elijah Thorne's residence on the morning of Monday, October 12th, the morning the bill of sale was signed." Caroline shifted in her seat. A flicker of doubt crossed her face, but she composed herself quickly. She probably thought it was just video of us signing papers. She didn't know about the audio. Sarah pressed play. The image on the screen was crisp and clear. There we were in my kitchen, me looking disheveled and worried, Dante looking hungover, and Caroline looking impatient and sharp. The audio filled the courtroom. It wasn't the soft, trembling voice Caroline had used on the stand. It was the sharp, commanding bark of a drill sergeant. $500 is nothing, the Caroline on the screen said, her voice dripping with contempt. "It is an insult to your mother's memory." Then my voice sounding weak and pleading. "Please, Caroline, please don't throw it away. I will go through it. I will sort it. Just give me a month." The Caroline on the screen slammed her hand on the table. The sound made the jurors jump. "No!" the digital Caroline hissed. "Monday. Elijah. It is done. I don't want you going back there and bringing that filth into this house." I watched the real Caroline. Her face had gone pale. She was gripping the railing of the witness stand so hard her knuckles were white. The video continued. It showed the arrival of Marcus. It showed Caroline standing on the porch, refusing to get close to him, wrinkling her nose. "You the lady who called about the storage unit?" Marcus asked on screen. "I am the screen," Caroline replied. "You have the cash." Then came the moment that sealed her fate. The moment I had acted my heart out. "Son," the screen Elijah said, "please, let me go through it first." And then Dante's voice, loud and aggressive. "We don't have a week. Sign the damn paper, Dad. It is just junk." And finally Caroline's ultimatum. The words that stripped away every shred of her caring daughter-in-law defense. Sign it. Or so help me God, I will have Dante drop you off at the homeless shelter tonight. Sarah paused the video right there. The image of Caroline's angry, twisted face was frozen on the giant screen looming over the real Caroline like a ghost of her own making. The courtroom erupted. It wasn't a murmur this time. It was a gasp of collective shock. The jurors were staring at Caroline with open mouths. The judge was glaring at her with a look that could melt steel. Sarah turned to Caroline. Her voice was ice cold. "Mrs. Thorne," Sarah said, "does that sound like a woman who is trying to protect her father-in-law's assets? Or does that sound like a woman who is bullying an elderly man into selling what she believes is trash because she is too cheap to pay a $50 storage fee?" Caroline was shaking. She looked at her lawyer, but Prescott was busy shuffling papers, distancing himself from the blast radius. I was stressed, Caroline stammered. "The video, it is out of context. We were under financial pressure." "Financial pressure," Sarah asked. "Or greed. You called the collection filth. You called it junk. You threatened to make him homeless. And now, because that junk turned out to be worth millions, you suddenly care about preserving the family legacy." Sarah clicked the remote again. A new video clip appeared. This one was from the previous week, showing Caroline and Dante toasting with wine in the living room while I sat alone in the kitchen. And the funny part, the screen Caroline laughed, is that he was crying about it. Literally crying over hair grease and old newspapers. Sarah stopped the video. "No further questions, Your Honor." Caroline didn't walk back to her table. She practically crawled. She slumped in her chair, covering her face with her hands. She knew it was over. The perfect blue suit, the modest bun, the tears, it was all exposed as a cheap costume. Judge Reynolds cleared his throat. He didn't even look at the other evidence. He didn't need to. "Mr. Prescott," the judge said, his voice dangerously low, "do you have any other witnesses? Or would you like to save the court's time and your client's dignity by resting your case now?" Prescott stood up. He looked defeated. "We rest, Your Honor." The judge leaned forward. He looked directly at Caroline. "Mrs. Thorne, in my 20 years on the bench, I have seen some despicable behavior. But to come into my courtroom under the guise of protecting the elderly while actively abusing and defrauding the very man you claim to care for is a special kind of depravity." He picked up a pen and signed a document on his desk with a flourish. "Case dismissed with prejudice. The sale of the storage unit to the Elijah Thorne Trust is valid and legal. Furthermore, I am sanctioning you, Mrs. Thorne, for filing a frivolous lawsuit. You are ordered to pay all legal fees for the defense." He paused and then added the final nail in the coffin. "And I am referring this video footage to the district attorney's office. What I saw on that screen looks a lot like elder abuse and extortion. I suggest you get a very good criminal defense lawyer. You are going to need one. Case closed." The gavel banged. It sounded like the final bell of a boxing match where one fighter is left unconscious on the mat. I stood up. Marcus stood up. We shook hands with Sarah. I looked over at Caroline. She was sitting alone. Her lawyer was already packing his briefcase, eager to get away from her. She looked up at me, her eyes red, her makeup ruined. "Elijah," she whispered. I didn't answer. I didn't smile. I just turned my back on her. I walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. The doors opened and the bright light of the hallway spilled in. It felt like walking out of a tomb. I was 73 years old. I had lost my wife. I had lost my son. But as I walked out of that courthouse, listening to the murmurs of the crowd and the clicking of cameras, I knew I had found something else. I had found my voice. Caroline wanted a war. She brought a lawsuit to a gunfight. And she had just learned that you don't pick a fight with a man who has nothing left to lose and everything to protect. I walked out into the Chicago afternoon. The sun was shining. It was a good day to start a foundation. It was a good day to build a library. And it was a damn good day to be Elijah Thorne. 3 weeks had passed since the court case. The leaves on the maple trees in my front yard had turned from green to a brilliant burning red, signaling the end of one season and the beginning of another. My life had changed just as drastically. The silence in my house was no longer heavy with grief. It was vibrant with purpose. I was a busy man. I had meetings with architects for the library. I had calls with Marcus about the second auction. But there was one piece of business that gave me a particular quiet satisfaction. I sat in my study holding a glossy brochure in my hand. It was the same brochure Caroline had left on my coffee table the day of Beatrice's funeral. Sun Valley Senior Living. a luxury community for the golden years. I remembered how she had looked at me when she handed it over. She had looked at me like I was expired goods, something to be shelved and forgotten in a place that smelled of bleach and despair. She had called it a sanctuary. I knew it was a warehouse for the unwanted, so I did the only logical thing a man with $2.5 million and a sense of irony does. I bought it. I bought the whole damn thing. It wasn't hard. The facility was failing financially, run into the ground by a corporate conglomerate that cared more about profit margins than patient care. They were eager to sell. I used a shell company at first just to keep things quiet, but once the deed was signed, I changed the name. It was no longer Sun Valley. It was the Beatrice Thorne Center for Dignity. But the universe in its infinite wisdom wasn't done with the irony yet. It had one more twist of the knife, one that I couldn't have planned if I were a writer for a soap opera. Caroline's parents, Robert and Linda Miller. They were people I had tolerated for years at Thanksgiving dinners. They were snobs. They looked down on Beatrice because she was a school teacher. They looked down on me because I worked with my hands. They were the ones who had encouraged Caroline to push Dante into high-yield investments. They wanted a son-in-law who was a tycoon, not an architect. So when Dante came to them with his crypto schemes and his real estate flips, they didn't ask questions. They saw greed and they recognized it as a family trait. They mortgaged their own house. They liquidated their retirement funds. They went all in on Dante and Caroline's empire of cards. And when that empire collapsed, it didn't just take Dante down, it took them too. Bankrupt, evicted, destitute. Caroline now drowning in legal fees and facing a potential criminal investigation for elder abuse couldn't take them in. She was sleeping on a friend's couch herself, so Robert and Linda became wards of the state, and the state in its bureaucratic efficiency assigned them to the nearest facility that accepted indigent cases. You guessed it. I was standing in the lobby of the newly renovated center on a Tuesday afternoon. I wasn't wearing a suit. I was wearing my work clothes, supervising the installation of new comfortable armchairs. The smell of urine and antiseptic was gone, replaced by the scent of fresh flowers and brewing coffee. I made sure the coffee was good. Beatrice always hated bad coffee. I saw Caroline's car pull up through the glass doors. It wasn't the luxury SUV she used to drive. That had been repossessed. She was driving a dented Honda Civic that looked 10 years old. She got out, looking tired. Her hair was messy. Her clothes looked wrinkled. She walked toward the entrance with her head down, a woman defeated by her own ambition. She was coming to visit her parents. She probably thought she was walking into a hellhole. She probably felt guilty that she had dragged them down to this. I stepped behind a large pillar near the reception desk. I wanted to watch. The automatic doors slid open. Caroline walked in. She stopped dead in her tracks. She was expecting gray linoleum and fluorescent lights. Instead, she was standing on plush carpet. There was soft jazz playing in the background. The walls were painted a warm, inviting cream color. But her eyes didn't stay on the furniture. They were drawn like a magnet to the massive oil painting hanging above the reception desk. It was 5 feet tall. It was the portrait of Beatrice I had commissioned from a local artist based on my favorite photo of her. In the painting, Beatrice looked regal. She was smiling, her eyes full of wisdom and kindness, looking down over the lobby like a guardian angel. Beneath the painting in gold letters was a plaque, dedicated to the memory of Beatrice Thorne, because everyone deserves to be treated like treasure. I watched Caroline's face. It crumbled. Her jaw dropped. Her eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of shock. Her brain couldn't process it. This was the woman she had called a hoarder. This was the woman whose legacy she had tried to throw in the dumpster. And now that woman was staring down at her, owning the very building where Caroline's parents were eating charity pudding. I stepped out from behind the pillar. "Hello, Caroline." She spun around. She looked at me, then back at the painting, then back at me. She looked like she was having a stroke. "Elijah," she whispered. What is this?" I walked over to the reception desk. The young woman working there smiled at me. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thorne," she said brightly. I nodded at her. "It is an investment, Caroline," I said, turning back to my daughter-in-law. "You remember this place, don't you? You left the brochure on my table. You said it was perfect for me." Caroline was shaking. You bought it." "I did," I said calmly. "I used the money from the first auction, the money from the junk." I gestured around the room. We fixed the heating. We hired better nurses. We improved the food. It is a nice place now. A place Beatrice would have been proud of. Caroline swallowed hard. Her voice was barely a whisper. My parents, they are here. I know I said. I saw the admission paperwork. Robert and Linda Miller, room 204. I took a step closer to her. They are in a nice room, Caroline. It has a view of the garden. They are eating 3 warm meals a day. They are safe. Caroline looked at me with confusion. She expected me to kick them out. She expected me to be as petty and cruel as she would have been. Why, she asked. After everything we did to you, why are you helping them? I looked up at the portrait of Beatrice. Because that is who Beatrice was, I said. She didn't turn people away. She didn't judge people by their bank accounts. She saved things that were broken and made them whole again. I looked back at Caroline. Your parents are victims of your greed, Caroline, just like I was, just like Dante was. I don't punish victims. I punish perpetrators. Caroline started to cry, real tears this time. It was the crushing weight of shame. She realized that the man she had tried to destroy was the only reason her parents weren't sleeping on the street. She realized that the mother-in-law she had despised was putting food in her parents' mouths from beyond the grave. You can go see them, I said. Visiting hours are until 8. I turned to walk away, but I stopped. Oh, and Caroline. She looked up, her mascara running down her face. Make sure you wipe your feet before you go up, I said. Beatrice liked a clean house. I didn't wait for an answer. I walked out of the lobby past the portrait of my wife. I walked out into the crisp autumn air. I could have evicted them. I could have banned the Miller family from the premises. It would have been easy. But this was better. Every time Caroline came to visit, she would have to walk under Beatrice's gaze. Every time she spoon-fed her father his soup, she would know that soup was paid for by the trash she tried to sell for $500. That wasn't just revenge. That was education. I got into my truck. I had a meeting with the architect for the library. We were finalizing the designs for the children's wing. I drove away from the Beatrice Thorne Center for Dignity. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw Caroline standing in the window looking out. She looked very small. My work there was done. I had turned a weapon into a shield. I had turned a prison into a sanctuary. And I had turned a tragedy into a legacy. Beatrice was right. You don't throw things away just because they look old or broken. You polish them, you fix them, and sometimes you find out they were holding the whole world together. I hummed a tune as I drove. It was one of Beatrice's favorites. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. It was a beautiful evening. And for the first time in a long time, the world felt balanced. The scales of justice had finally tipped, and they were tipping in favor of the good guys. The payoff wasn't the money. The payoff was the look on Caroline's face when she realized that kindness in the end is the most powerful weapon of all. Winter came to Chicago early that year. The wind off the lake was sharp enough to cut glass, stripping the trees bare and turning the city into a landscape of gray concrete and white snow. But inside my life, things had never been warmer. The library was no longer just a blueprint on a table. It was rising from the ground. Steel beams were going up brick by brick, creating a fortress of knowledge right in the heart of the neighborhood where Beatrice and I had spent our lives. The Beatrice Thorne Center for Dignity was operating at full capacity with a waiting list of families who wanted their loved ones cared for by people who actually gave a damn. But while my world was building up, my son's world was tearing itself down, brick by crumbling brick. I didn't have to hire a private investigator to know what happened to Dante. Bad news travels fast, especially in a community that had watched him strut around like a peacock for years. The collapse of Dante Thorne was not a sudden explosion. It was a slow, humiliating slide. It started with the divorce. Caroline didn't wait for the dust to settle. The moment the judge dismissed her lawsuit, the moment she realized there would be no settlement, no payout, and no golden parachute, she cut the cord. She filed for divorce 3 days after the trial. Her grounds were irreconcilable differences, but everyone knew the real reason was insufficient funds. She didn't just leave him. She scorched the earth. She took the furniture from their rented condo. She took the dog. She even took the espresso machine. She left him with nothing but his debt and his shame. Then came the liquidation. I heard from a friend at the pawn shop on 35th Street that a man fitting Dante's description had come in to sell a Rolex Submariner. He got pennies on the dollar for it because he was desperate for cash to pay off the interest on his loans. The red Mercedes. That was repossessed in the middle of the day while he was trying to impress a client for a job he didn't get. Dante was stripped. The layers of pretension, the Italian suits, the expensive cologne, the leased luxury cars, they were all peeled away until there was nothing left but a frightened, middle-aged man who had never learned how to work. He tried to call me a few times in the beginning. I saw his number on the caller ID. I never answered. I let it ring until it went to voicemail, and then I deleted the messages without listening to them. I wasn't being cruel. I was maintaining the boundary. I had given him 40 years of chances. I had given him an education. I had given him unconditional love. He had traded it all for a lie. I assumed he had left town. I assumed he had run to Miami to find that girl Jessica, only to find that she too had no use for a broke man. But I was wrong. Dante was still in Chicago. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late November. The sky was the color of a bruised, threatening snow. I was standing in the front yard of my house. We were breaking ground on the final phase of the project, the Beatrice Thorne Memorial Garden. It was going to be a public space, a sanctuary of flowers and benches where people could sit and read. I was wearing a thick wool coat and a hard hat, holding a set of blueprints, talking to the foreman about the placement of the fountain. I looked sharp. I had started wearing suits again, not because I had to, but because I felt like it. I felt like a man who had a legacy to uphold. "Excuse me, Mr. Thorne," the foreman said, pointing to the street. "I think this delivery is for you." I turned around. A large beat-up delivery van had pulled up to the curb. It wasn't one of the major carriers. It was one of those third-party logistics companies that hire anyone with a driver's license and a pulse. The truck was rusted around the wheel wells, and the engine was sputtering, coughing out black smoke into the cold air. The driver's side door opened. A man stepped out. He was wearing a uniform that was too big for him, a generic blue jacket with a cheap logo patch on the chest. He wore a knit cap pulled low over his ears and fingerless gloves that looked threadbare. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who had been hauling boxes for 10 hours straight. He walked around to the back of the truck and rolled up the door. He pulled out a heavy dolly and stacked 3 large boxes onto it. The boxes were heavy. I could tell by the way his shoulders slumped under the weight as he tilted the dolly back. He turned and started pushing the load up the driveway. He kept his head down, focusing on the cracks in the pavement, fighting the friction of the snow. He got about halfway up the drive before he looked up to see where he was going. He stopped. The dolly didn't move. The wind whipped around us, rattling the blueprints in my hand. It was Dante. But it wasn't the Dante I knew. His face was gaunt, the skin gray and drawn. He had a patchy beard speckled with gray hairs I had never noticed before. The arrogance was gone from his eyes, replaced by a dull, hollow resignation. He stared at me. He stared at his father, standing tall in a cashmere coat, surrounded by a crew of workers who were building a monument to his mother. He stared at the house he had tried to sell, which now gleamed with fresh paint and new windows. He looked at the clipboard in his hand, then back at the house number. He must have been so tired, so on autopilot, that he hadn't even checked the address until he was standing in the driveway. The silence between us was louder than the construction noise. I saw his throat work as he swallowed. I saw his hands tighten on the handle of the dolly. For a moment, I thought he was going to say something. I thought he was going to drop the boxes and run, or maybe fall to his knees and beg again. "Dad," he whispered. The word was carried away by the wind, barely reaching me. I didn't step forward. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I just looked at him. I looked at him the way you look at a stranger who has taken a wrong turn. I looked at him with polite indifference. He waited. He was waiting for me to save him. He was waiting for me to say, "Son, put those boxes down and come inside. It is cold. Come have some soup." He was waiting for the father he had exploited to reappear, but that father was gone. That father had been buried along with Beatrice. I slowly rolled up the blueprints I was holding. I tapped them against my leg. Then I gave him a nod. It wasn't a nod of forgiveness. It wasn't a nod of welcome. It was a single curt dip of the chin. Acknowledgement of presence. Nothing more. It was the kind of nod you give to the mailman or the cashier at the grocery store. Professional. Distant. Final. I turned to the foreman. "Make sure the fountain is centered," I said, my voice steady and clear. Beatrice loved symmetry. I turned my back on Dante. I walked toward the front door of my house. I could feel his eyes on my back. I could feel his desperation reaching out like a claw trying to snag my coat. Mr. Thorne, the foreman, called out, "Do you want a sign for this delivery?" I stopped on the porch. I didn't turn around. "No," I said loud enough for Dante to hear. "Have one of the crew sign for it. I have work to do inside." I opened the heavy oak door. The warmth of the house spilled out, golden and inviting. I stepped across the threshold. I didn't slam the door. I closed it firmly with a definitive, heavy click. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening. Outside, I heard the foreman say something. I heard the scuff of boots on concrete. I heard the rumble of the dolly wheels as Dante unloaded the boxes books for the library, ironically enough. Then I heard the heavy, rusted slam of the delivery truck's door. The engine coughed to life, whining in protest against the cold. The truck rumbled away, fading down the street, taking my son with it. I walked into the living room and went to the window. I watched the truck disappear around the corner, leaving nothing behind but a cloud of exhaust and tire tracks in the slush. My heart didn't break. It beat steadily, a strong, rhythmic drum. Dante was alive. He was working. He was learning the value of $1 the hard way for the first time in his life. In a way, this was the greatest gift I could give him. I had stopped crippling him with my help. I had let him fall so that maybe one day he could learn how to stand up on his own. But he would do it over there, outside the gate. I turned away from the window. I looked at the portrait of Beatrice above the fireplace. "We did it, honey," I said softly. "The garden will be beautiful in the spring." I went to the kitchen to make a pot of tea. I had a meeting with the library board in an hour. I had a foundation to run. I had a legacy to build. And for the first time in my life, I was living for myself. The delivery was made. The past was unloaded, and the door was closed.